She was a single mom who found happiness with a new man.
It seemed like it would be a perfect match.
He always talked with good intentions.
Say the relationship was great. They was doing good.
Until an unimaginable crime tears them apart.
It just shocked me.
It was a double murder.
Just a day I wish would have never happened.
That struck fear in the entire town.
Rumors swirl about who's responsible.
The community knew something bad was going to happen.
Basically, everybody knew each other.
I don't think there were any secrets.
Yeah, admit you didn't do it.
He said he was going to do his execution and stuff. I said, talking that crazy time.
That's when he came in and he admitted the truth.
But will justice ever be served?
Her family had to go through this over and over.
This was a death penalty case.
It's just gruesome.
There's no reason for this to occur like it did.
It was like, oh, wow. It's heartbreaking.
September 11th, 1995. It's a sleepy Monday morning in Vidette, Georgia, a rural crossroads between Savannah and Atlanta.
It was just a little small community.
It probably didn't have a population of over 200.
There was a flashing light in the main intersection and a convenience store, but mostly it's agricultural.
This morning, the sun still hangs low over the horizon when Jasmine Jenkins pulls up outside the home of her sister, Brenda Palmer.
It was their practice that her sister would come pick her up in the morning and they would go over into Jefferson County where they worked at a sewing plant.
But today, when Jasmine arrives, Brenda isn't waiting outside.
Come on, Brenda!
She blew the horn, no one answered.
Thinking her sister had overslept, Jasmine goes to the door.
We're going to be late!
The front door is slightly open. And she starts to get like this funny feeling that something is not right.
Brenda?
She's at the door, no one answered. So she went in there.
She sees Brenda's teenage daughter, Christine, who normally sleeps in the front room.
Only she wasn't asleep.
She was laying in the bed with a bullet hole in her head.
In a panic, Jasmine runs back to Brenda's bedroom.
She looked inside the other room and she seen my sister stretched out.
She had 2 bullet wounds to the head.
31-year-old Brenda Jenkins Palmer had always been a small-town girl.
We grew up in the country part of Vidette. Everybody got along. I mean, it was just a little great town.
Though life wasn't always easy for Brenda growing up, she was always surrounded by love.
Her father passed, then my father passed. So the 2 families, my mom and her mother, sisters, we kind of grew up together like sisters and brothers.
As the oldest of her siblings, Brenda learned to pull her weight at a young age.
She helped take care of her other siblings. When we was younger, she got a job. She did all that, running around and paid the bills for the family, helping out as much as she could.
And she always set a good example.
She was a church-going person. She wasn't the type of person that caused trouble. She always been there to help somebody. She was just a great all-around person.
She was also an outstanding mother.
She had a child at a young age.
The father was never in Christine's life, so brother played both roles in raising her daughter.
Under her mother's loving care, Christine thrived.
They spent a lot of time together. Brenda kept Christine in the church.
Christine was a good student. She was on the honor roll and in the marching band. She was apparently a very happy person.
And Brenda was happy too. But there was one thing missing.
Brenda was looking for love.
And then she found it with an older man named Willie Palmer.
Willie, he had like a little club that he served food and stuff.
What can I get you?
I don't know. I've never been here before.
Well, I'm the owner. Ask me anything.
This is your place?
Absolutely.
He was from a well-known family in that area.
You grew up around here?
Yeah, just down the road where I grew up.
I can't believe we've never met.
I know, right? You're gorgeous, by the way.
They hit it off. It was like almost love at first sight.
As the couple grew closer, they formed a beautiful blended family.
He seemed to accept Brenda's daughter, Christine, and Brenda accepted his 3 children from a previous marriage.
Brenda also grew close to Willie's teenage nephew, Frederico.
Hey, Brenda, can you pick me up after practice today?
Sure, hon.
All right. Hey, I'll see y'all.
She actually loved Freddie. She did a lot of good things for him.
Before long, Brenda and Willie married and bought some property out in the country.
It was 5 or 6 acres all together.
It's a nice piece of land.
And a new home wasn't all the couple had to celebrate.
The baby came along. They was doing good. He was good to Brenda.
But now Brenda's sister has just walked into a horrific scene.
Brenda's daughter was shot in the face in her bed, and then Brenda was shot in the head.
Oh, thank God.
Miraculously, Brenda's infant daughter was unharmed.
She was just lying on the bed, not obviously realizing what had happened.
Then, trying to collect herself, Jasmine picks up the phone to call 911.
This is 1995, so all she had was a landline.
What the?
But when she picks it up, there's no dial tone.
What? The phone line is dead.
In 1995, after raising her daughter Christine as a single mom, 31-year-old Brenda Jenkins Palmer had found happiness again with her new husband, 42-year-old Willie Palmer.
Willie and Brenda also had a 1-year-old daughter of their own.
It was a great blended family.
But now, Brenda's sister has walked into a horrifying scene inside her sister's home.
Brenda was lying on the floor. She had 2 bullet wounds to the head. Christine, she had been shot in the face.
However, Brenda and Willie's baby girl was unharmed.
That child was on the bed with the daughter, Christine.
With the home phone dead, Brenda's sister takes the baby and races out the door.
This is 1995 in rural Georgia, so few people had cell phones.
She ran back out the door and ran to the local convenience store, and she told him to dial 911.
But when first responders reach the tiny rural crossroads where Brenda lives, there's no saving her or her daughter.
They're both pronounced dead at the scene.
Get her out of here. Yes. Ma'am, why don't you come over here?
And while Brenda's little girl appears unharmed, first responders tending to her in the ambulance decide to transport her to the hospital, just to be sure.
They also allowed Brenda's sister to accompany the child.
She was crying. She couldn't talk.
Please, and GBI.
Given the magnitude of the case, Burke County Police call in the Georgia Bureau of Investigation.
The GBI took over in the investigation because it was a double murder and a little bit more complex.
It takes time for agents to reach the remote location, deep in the Georgia countryside.
I couldn't see the house from the road because of a twisty driveway that led from the highway to the house.
When we arrived, we kind of did a walk through the scene.
The first thing the investigators notice is the broken lock on the front door.
The door was kicked in.
And inside the door was the first victim, Brenda's daughter, Christine.
Right there in that front room, it was a little twin-sized bed.
She was partially sitting up in the bed, and I could see a wound on her face. There was blood on the bed and a little bit of blood spatter on the other side.
In the line of business, some are worse than the others, and this was one of the worst ones, especially when you see a 15-year-old kid shot in the face.
Examining her, I noted on top of a sheet that was covering her leg a cartridge casing.
The investigators bagged the shell casing as evidence before heading into the next room.
And there was Brenda lying on the floor.
There was some sheets that her feet had gotten tangled into.
She was obviously pulled out of bed.
No!
There was blood coming from her head.
She had 2 bullet wounds.
Nearby, the investigators find 2 more cartridge casings that are a match for the one they found in Christine's bed.
They were 22 long rifle casings.
Then, after finding the phone line dead, the investigators head outside to check the wiring.
There was a telephone interface box attached to the house. This interface box would be where the wire comes from the telephone company, and you would run wires into the house for the telephone service.
But in this case, the box had been opened and the wires disconnected.
Suspecting the killer had disconnected the phone before heading inside, the investigators removed the interface box from the house.
We took the telephone interface box to be processed for a fingerprint.
That may eventually give investigators the suspect's identity. But the motive behind the murders remains a mystery.
You don't know if it's a robbery gone bad or whatever.
And it's not like there are any potential witnesses nearby.
She lived in an isolated area down this 2-lane dirt logging road.
However, the investigators do have someone to turn to.
Hey, you need to let me out, huh?
Brenda's family has begun to gather outside the crime scene tape.
I got a call from my cousin. Something really bad happened down here in Vidette.
What's going on?
Unfortunately, Brenda and Christine were murdered.
It just shocked me. I didn't know what to think or what to do. I mean, it just like everybody almost lost it.
Everybody was getting all upset and talking crazy and everything, man. It was a bad day for the whole family.
But as Brenda's brother speaks with the investigators, his shock quickly turns to suspicion.
Who do you think might have done this?
Her husband, Willie Palmer.
He was the first one came to my mind.
The relationship between the two was very volatile.
She had filed for divorce.
Jenkins Palmer has just told Georgia Bureau of Investigation agents that they believe her husband, Willie Palmer, was behind the shooting that killed her and her daughter, Christine.
I was just about 95% sure what had happened was because of him.
Willie was the most obvious because of the problems they were having.
According to the family, Brenda had recently filed for divorce.
They say that things between Willie and Brenda had started off well.
When they first started, their relationship was great. From what I saw, they was doing good and everything.
They were living up in Goff, which is a different community than Vidette.
But not long after the baby was born, Brenda and the girls moved out.
She didn't give me an explanation. She never would go into details on nothing.
She never told me why.
Was she abusive? She didn't mention no abuse to us.
However, Brenda's actions suggest the answer may be yes.
Brenda had to get a restraining order against him.
And when Willie violated it, she had him arrested.
He was sent to county jail.
And while he was in jail, Brenda looked for a new place for her and her daughters to live.
She tried to make sure that he would not be able to find her.
In a big city, that might mean a women's shelter, but not deep in rural Georgia.
She had to just find a small house somewhere out in the middle of nowhere.
And she found it at the end of a dirt road on the outskirts of Vidette.
The residence was basically a two-room shack.
It's a sad thing to know that somebody had to live in it, and even sadder that somebody died in it.
It was only supposed to be temporary.
From what she told me, she had money saved up and she was working on getting her a better place.
But she'd barely settled in when her cousin learned that Willie was out of jail.
I walked in the house and I said, "Brother," I said, "I just seen him." She said, "That can't be. Ain't no way." I said, "I just seen him at the phone booth." And she sat there for a minute and I said, "I just want to let you know he out." And she acted like it wasn't really nothing serious about it.
When was that? Couple days ago.
That actually was my last conversation with her. I don't know if she was frightened or concerned or what, but I know 2 days later, all this happened.
And now that Brenda and her daughter are dead, the family is convinced that Willie had something to do with it.
So you think that he came out here to the house and killed her?
It had to be him.
He was trying to find her, but he didn't know where she was at. How he found out about it, I don't know.
Had Willie shot and killed his estranged wife and stepdaughter?
The pending divorce did give him a possible motive.
And that's not the only thing that suggests he might be responsible.
That Brenda Palmer and Christine were shot and killed, but the baby was not, indicated that there was a reason for the baby not to be killed.
The investigators suspected the reason is a simple one.
And that was a love of the child.
Willie may have hesitated to hurt his own flesh and blood.
We'll be in touch. Thank you for being in touch.
With Willie now a person of interest, the investigators bring him in for questioning.
Obviously, you want to either put him in the homicide or eliminate him.
Although when the interview begins, Willie seems surprised by the news that his stepdaughter and Brenda are dead.
What about the baby?
She's fine.
Thank God.
Willie admits that he and Brenda had problems, but he claims to have moved on from the relationship.
When Brenda and Willie's relationship was ending, he reached back out to his previous wife, Suzanne, and convinced her that they should give it another try. And she let him move back in.
And he said that once Brenda had put him in jail for violating the restraining order, he'd realized that there was no going back.
Okay. So have you seen her since you got out of jail?
Yeah, a couple days ago I went over to a new spot just to get the rest of my stuff.
So you were out there on Sunday night?
Willie denied any involvement in the death of Christine and Brenda.
So where were you that night?
I was with my nephew, Federico.
He said they were in Augusta, away from the area.
I was with him all day.
All right, that's all for now. Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
And when the GBI agents contact Federico, he confirms his uncle's story.
He said they drove to Augusta.
But did that mean it was true, or was Willie's nephew just covering for him?
Frederico was a lot younger. He was a late teenager.
I believe Frederico was actually really scared of Willie Palmer.
With doubts about Willie's alibi, the investigators head back to the tiny crossroads of Vidette.
There's just one store in Vidette, just a little country store, and nothing else.
What's going on?
Good afternoon, sir.
But that one country store had just what the investigators need.
Yeah, I was here at the store when she came in to call the police.
Yeah?
I knew Willie was up to something when he passed by the night before.
The witness put Willie in the area that night.
He saw Willie's car pass by on the night of the murder.
Georgia Bureau of Investigation agents believe they may be one step closer to solving the murders of Brenda Jenkins Palmer and her teenage daughter, Christine.
A clerk at the county store near Brenda's house says he saw Willie's car pass by on the night of the murder.
He's an important witness that put Willie in the area.
Are you sure it was Willie?
Oh, yeah, I'm pretty sure it was Willie.
This was a little small community. Basically, everybody knew each other.
We all attend same churches, the same schools, work in the same places, shop in the same areas.
And the clerk isn't the only one who was pretty sure Willie had committed the murders.
Willie Palmer was a very dangerous man to be around. And that's not from me, that's coming from the people in that area.
However, Willie's reputation around the county wasn't the only reason people thought he was behind the murders.
A lot of people was coming to me and telling me, said, well, he said he was gonna kill her.
Thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it.
No problem.
Homicide?
And it wasn't long before those stories started making their way back to the GBI agents investigating the murders.
Willie Palmer said that he was going to kill Brenda Jenkins, and he said, y'all watch me. He said, I mean what I say.
Homicide.
Willie Palmer had been going all over Burke County, basically, saying he was going to kill Brenda.
He said, I'm going to do it execution style. And you'll see.
And that's exactly what happened.
He was referring to Brenda Jenkins. Yeah.
It was becoming clear that he was responsible for their murders.
And the picture becomes even clearer when a woman named Tammy Howell contacts the investigators and says she has information about the murders.
Homicide.
Tammy worked at a loan company and Brenda was a customer.
About a month ago, Brenda came in. She was nervous acting because she was scared of Willie Palmer. She had just put him in jail.
She begged her not to tell Willie where she moved to because she did not want him to find her.
She said that she was scared if he got out of jail, he was going to kill her.
Tammy says that Willie had come in a few weeks later.
He said he'd just gotten out of jail.
Willie was at the loan company trying to borrow money for an attorney for dealing with the restraining order that Brenda had taken against him.
And according to Tammy, he was obviously upset about it.
He said something like, the last thing he does is to kill that.
Tammy said that she and her coworkers didn't take Willie too seriously at the time.
He was always a polite person, and that's why we didn't really think anything else because we just thought it was like anger. You know, get angry, you just gonna say something.
They didn't really think he would do it.
Still, she had done as Brenda asked.
The lady at the loan company would not tell Willie Palmer where Brenda was living.
But had Willie somehow found out and followed through on his threats?
A lot of people did know where Brenda lived during that time, and it would almost be virtually impossible to keep someone from finding that out.
Have a seat right over here, please.
Their suspicion of Willie deepening The investigators ask his ex-wife Suzanne to come to the station to see if she has any information.
My sister Brenda and Suzanne, they knew each other pretty good.
Willie had also told them he reconnected with Suzanne after he split up with Brenda.
So how long were you and Willie married?
10 years.
What happened?
His temper mostly.
Before he married Brenda, there was a history of problems with his first wife.
Suzanne also confirms that after Brenda left Willie, she had decided to give him another chance.
Things were going okay between Suzanne and Willie for a while, but it wasn't long before she remembered why they broke up in the first place.
His temper came back.
Oh yeah, it sure did.
Willie became so irate and he started making all these threats.
I gotta be honest with you. I was relieved when Brenda put him back in jail.
She was actually also very scared of Willie.
And according to Suzanne, she had good reason to be.
He had recently tried to kill her.
I was relieved when Brenda put him back in jail.
Georgia Bureau of Investigation agents have just learned that their lead suspect, Willie Palmer, had tried to kill his ex-wife Suzanne, too.
When did this happen?
The night before Brenda was killed.
Suzanne was in the car with her sister, and Willie rammed into the back of them, trying to run them off the road.
Then he chased us for over a mile till I drove up to that fire hall.
She was petrified.
It was becoming clear that if anybody was going to be responsible for killing Brenda, it was Willie.
All right, thank you for coming. I'll walk you out.
Hoping to prove it, the investigators decide it's time to lean on Willie's nephew, Frederico Palmer.
We want to talk about the night of Sunday, September 10th.
Frederico was Willie's alibi for the night of the murder.
But he was also the murder plot's weakest link.
I confronted Frederico, telling him, "Frederico, you were there, weren't you?" And he goes, "Yep."
He told me to come ride somewhere with him.
Frederico says Willie had initially told him that they were going to Augusta, which is the same story given to the investigators.
But rather than going to that nightclub, they went toward Vidette.
And he said, "Yeah, me, should he do it?" I said, "No." Should he do what? Shoot Brenda.
Frederico says he tried to talk his uncle out of it, but it was no use.
Willie has his mind made up.
He said, "I got to do it." But she trying to take everything he got us. Did he mention Christine? Not till we got down there.
According to Frederico, once they drove down the dirt road that led to Brenda's house, Willie stopped the car and then pulled a rifle out from the back seat.
What kind of gun is it? I can't give it. 22, right?
Yeah.
A .22 is a match for the shell casings recovered at the crime scene.
Then, after taking the gun, Willie told his nephew to drive.
He told me to go park the car, walk back down there.
Back to the house?
Yeah, I need your help with something.
Okay.
He felt like he didn't have a choice.
It was either you help me or else I will get you.
Frederico says when he walked back down to the house, his uncle was fumbling around with a telephone box outside.
Man, the damn thing won't... Yeah, you try.
So, let me ask you this. Who opened the box up?
I opened.
And what'd you do when you got it open?
Pull the plug in, pull it up.
He asked Frederico to undo the phone line, which he obliged.
Frederico says that by the time he finished disconnecting the phone line, Willie was already pounding on Brenda's front door.
Brenda, wake up!
They kicked the door in. Johnny went in. I heard a shot.
Willie basically raised the rifle and just shot her straight between the eyes.
Then, leaving Christine dead in the front room, Willie proceeded into Brenda's room.
My sister woke up and she grabbed the baby.
She grabbed the baby because she knew that he would never harm the baby.
He was in there talking to her, told her, give me the baby. And she won't get it to him. So he told her, get the baby from her.
Give me the baby! Give me the baby! Fred, get in here! Get the baby.
His nephew pulled her out of my sister's arm.
Look at me.
Last night, the baby and Brenda fell on the floor.
Frederico said he then took the baby out of the residence.
And once he was on the porch, he heard shots.
How many shots do you hear?
2 or 3.
Then, according to Frederico, Willie came out onto the porch and told him to take the baby back inside.
He said, pull it down this side of me.
So y'all left the baby laying there, tried to run everything shot.
Yeah,
Is that
cool.
correct?
Yeah.
Frederico says they then went back to Willie's home, changed clothes, and disposed of the evidence.
Frederico told me Willie ended up throwing the clothing that he wore and the .22 rifle in a creek that was located on Highway 305 in Burke County.
It's a compelling story. But is it the truth?
Frederico said they left the baby with Brenda, but that's not where Brenda's sister found her.
That morning, she came in and found Christine on the bed with the baby.
It's conceivable that the baby had crawled into the bed with her half-sister at some point during the night.
So, to verify the rest of his story, GBI agents head to the creek where Frederico claimed Willie disposed of the evidence.
We ended up getting a guy from Burke County Emergency Management Association to come out to the scene where he claimed Willie Palmer threw clothing, shoes, and a rifle. And it wasn't long he found the rifle.
The investigators sent the rifle, a .22, to the state crime lab.
They test-fired the .22 rifle that we recovered out of the creek, compared it to casings inside the residence, and it was a match.
It's more than enough for the investigators to charge Willie with Brenda and Christine's murders.
They understood our pain, and, they wanted justice for my sister just like I did.
This was a death penalty case.
And everything about the case pointed towards Willie.
Georgia Bureau of Investigation agents have arrested 42-year-old Willie Palmer for the murder of his estranged wife Brenda Jenkins Palmer and her teenage daughter.
The prosecutors have announced that they intend to pursue the death penalty.
Despite the seriousness of the charges, Willie refuses to talk.
That's the coldest man I have ever been involved with trying to talk to in my career.
But will his silence matter?
The prosecutors also charged Willie's nephew, Frederico Palmer, for his role in the murders.
The district attorney felt like Frederico was as guilty as Willie, and I do too. His own actions that he admitted put him right in the middle of it, and everything he said fit. There was nothing that he told me that I could disprove.
And now the prosecutors need Frederico to tell his story to a jury.
To have an eyewitness co-conspirator testimony, you don't get that a lot. And so his testimony was extremely important.
They offered Frederico life without parole rather than a death sentence if he would testify.
He agreed to plead guilty and testify against his uncle.
When Willie goes on trial in April of 1997, the prosecutors portray him as a man with a vendetta.
It was because of anger or wrath, a need for revenge.
Brenda got him locked up after he violated his restraining order, and she was also fighting him in court.
When they divorced, she wanted his property.
Willie's mind was made up.
We don't know exactly how he found out where she lived, but a lot of people did know. And I think that's how word got back to Willie.
Then, on the night of September 10th, Willie and his nephew Frederico snuck up Brenda's long, remote drive.
Frederico undid the phone line.
Willie kicked the door in, shot Christine in the head.
He then went in Brenda's room, and Brenda had the baby in her arms.
Fred, get in here!
So Willie told Frederico, get the baby from her.
No!
Frederico got the baby, and then Willie shot Brenda twice.
Basically, she was executed.
It's just, gruesome.
But despite strong evidence and his nephew testifying against him, the prosecutors are still unable to convict Willie.
The first trial was a mistrial.
The defense claimed the DA's office did not provide one of the statements I took from Frederico, which in fact they did have it, because I found it in their discovery notes, which is what is given to the defense. So that means they had it, but they claimed they didn't, and the judge called it mistrial.
2 more trials followed, but the prosecutors could never make a conviction stick.
It seemed like there were a number of issues. I think the main reason was being tried in Burke County, where everybody knew each other. They just couldn't find a jury that could agree.
A juror's insight is so different from my insight or a defense attorney's insight. And this was a death penalty case. It was a big decision.
Then the next trial, there was the issue of Mr. Palmer's intellectual disability or whether he had one.
Since he was never acquitted, Willie remains in prison the entire time.
He was not going to get bond. They send him back to Burke County Jail, where he remains until he's tried again.
But the family and the prosecution are determined to get justice for Brenda and Christine.
I knew what the right verdict was. I knew we had the right guy.
And in 2023, almost 30 years after the murders, Willie stands trial for a 4th time.
When we retried him again, the death penalty was taken off the table.
And this time, the prosecution finally gets a conviction that sticks.
They find him guilty on all counts.
Willie got life without parole.
After such a long, long wait, it's a satisfying outcome.
He won't never get out of prison.
He won't do this to nobody else.
But while justice has been served, the murders of Brenda and her 15-year-old daughter, Christine, remain a senseless tragedy.
These 2 individuals did not deserve to have their life end.
Brenda was always doing everything she can to make life better for everybody that she could.
Christine never harmed anyone in her life.
She would have been, 45 or so now, having a family of her own.
There's no reason for this to occur like it did. None.
There is a profound and unsettling contrast between the untouched beauty of a tropical paradise and the grim, quiet horrors that human beings are capable of inflicting upon one another. When we think of the Hawaiian Islands, our minds naturally drift toward images of serenity. We imagine endless expanses of azure water, gentle trade winds, and landscapes so breathtaking they seem to exist outside the boundaries of ordinary time. We do not typically associate these remote stretches of the Pacific with violence, with desperation, or with the cold, calculated concealment of a human body. Yet, it is often in the most isolated, majestic places on Earth that the darkest secrets are buried. The isolation that draws travelers seeking peace is the exact same isolation that provides a perpetrator with the perfect shadow to commit the unthinkable. To understand the sheer gravity of this case, you first have to understand the geography of the place where it unfolded. Waipio Valley, located along the Hamakua coast on the northern shore of Hawaii Island, is a place of staggering, almost intimidating natural beauty. It is frequently referred to as the Valley of the Kings, a deeply sacred site steeped in ancient Hawaiian history and culture. The valley is surrounded on three sides by sheer, towering cliffs that plunge thousands of feet down toward a sprawling valley floor, terminating dramatically at a remote black sand beach where the relentless waves of the Pacific Ocean crash against the shore. Accessing this valley is notoriously difficult. The road leading down into the basin is incredibly steep, narrow, and treacherous, requiring specialized vehicles and a deep respect for the terrain. Because of this formidable natural barrier, Waipio Valley remains relatively cut off from the modern world. It is a sanctuary. It is quiet, vast, and detached from the bustling tourist hubs of the island. When you stand on the black sands of Waipio, you feel completely removed from civilization. It is a place where you can easily disappear from the grid, and tragically, it is also a place where a life can be extinguished and hidden away with terrifying ease. The year was 1999. The turn of the millennium was approaching, and the Big Island maintained a distinct, laid-back culture that attracted free spirits, wanderers, and those looking to live a transient lifestyle outside the rigid confines of mainstream society. People came to places like the Hilo and Puna districts to hitchhike, to camp, and to exist in harmony with the rugged landscape. The days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun and the movement of the tides. It was an era before smartphones mapped our every coordinate, before ubiquitous surveillance cameras monitored every rural intersection, and before social media left a permanent, digital footprint of our daily interactions. In 1999, if you wanted to wander the island by thumbing rides from strangers, you left almost no trace behind. You existed only in the fleeting memories of the people you passed on the road. This culture of anonymity and transient movement would later become the greatest obstacle in solving a murder that would haunt the island for more than 2.5 decades. June 1st, 1999, began like any other early summer day in Waipio Valley. The weather was typical for the season, and the remote black sand beach had drawn a scattering of visitors. These were people seeking the quiet solitude that the valley offered, looking to spend a peaceful afternoon walking along the shoreline, listening to the rhythmic, deafening roar of the ocean against the volcanic sand. There was no sense of impending dread, no atmospheric shift to indicate that the day was about to fracture into a nightmare. For hours, the scene was entirely idyllic. The valley walls stood as silent sentinels around the beach, and the ocean breeze swept across the dunes. Sometime during that Tuesday afternoon, a dog accompanying a group of beachgoers began to act erratically near a specific mound of sand. Dogs perceive the world through a sensory lens far more complex and primal than our own. While the humans present simply saw a natural, undulating dune on the beach, the animal detected something buried beneath the surface. Driven by instinct, the dog approached the mound and began to dig. The paws kicked back the heavy, dark volcanic sand, carving a shallow depression into the dune. Initially, such behavior would hardly draw serious attention. A dog digging on a beach might be pursuing a crab, a buried piece of driftwood, or some other harmless piece of oceanic debris. The beachgoers likely paid little mind at first, allowing the animal to continue its frantic excavation of the sand. But as the dog dug deeper, the shape of what was hidden beneath the surface began to emerge from the darkness. The dark sand gave way, and the mundane tranquility of the afternoon was completely shattered. What protruded from the newly dug hole was not a piece of driftwood. It was human hair. And beneath that hair, the undeniable, unmistakable curvature of a human skull. The realization of what they were looking at would have been paralyzing. The beachgoers were suddenly confronted with the ultimate terror, forced to comprehend that they were standing directly on top of a shallow grave. Beneath their feet lay the decomposing remains of a human being, deliberately discarded and covered up in one of the most beautiful places on earth. Panic set in. The isolation of the valley, which only moments before had felt like a peaceful retreat, suddenly transformed into a terrifying trap. The pristine nature of Waipio Valley had been violated by a brutal act of violence, and the beachgoers were entirely alone with the physical evidence of that brutality. At approximately 2:47 in the afternoon, the Hawaii Police Department received the frantic dispatch. Officers were immediately deployed, but responding to a call in Waipio Valley is never a simple, rapid process. The treacherous descent down the steep cliff road takes time. As the police vehicles carefully navigated the descent, the beachgoers were left waiting near the mound of sand, standing guard over a horrific discovery as the vast Pacific Ocean continued to crash indifferently against the shore. When the authorities finally arrived on the scene, they cordoned off the area and began the grim task of carefully excavating the rest of the mound. What they uncovered was a tragedy that would defy answers for decades. The body pulled from the black sand was in a state of severe, advanced decomposition. The unforgiving elements of the coastal environment, the heat, the moisture, the sand, and the passage of time, had ravaged the remains. It was immediately apparent to the investigators that visual identification of the victim would be entirely impossible. There was no face left to recognize. The person pulled from the sand was stripped of their identity, reduced to a nameless John Doe, buried, and left to rot at the edge of the world. The remains were carefully secured, placed into a transport bag, and taken out of the isolated valley, leaving behind a scarred dune and a mystery that was only just beginning. The body was transported directly to the morgue at the Hilo Medical Center, where forensic specialists would begin the arduous process of working backward from death, trying to piece together the identity of the victim and the manner in which they had met their end. Because visual identification was out of the question, the medical examiners had to rely on forensic science to give the victim his name back. They managed to recover viable fingerprints from the badly decomposed remains. Those prints were run through the system, and soon, the John Doe was no longer nameless. His name was Matthew Joel Peak. He was only 22 years old. Matthew was a young man with his entire adult life ahead of him, a life that had been abruptly and violently stolen. But the identification was only the first piece of the puzzle. The most crucial and harrowing revelation came from the medical examiner's physical assessment of Matthew's remains. Despite the severe decomposition, the autopsy yielded a definitive and terrifying cause of death. Matthew Joel Peak did not drown in the ocean and wash ashore. He did not succumb to the elements. He did not suffer a tragic, accidental fall from the towering cliffs of the valley. The medical examiner determined the official cause of death to be asphyxia. Someone had restricted his airway. Someone had suffocated or strangled him. Someone had looked a 22-year-old man in the eyes, overpowered him, and forcibly taken his last breath from his lungs. The official classification was handed down by the authorities without hesitation: homicide. This was murder in paradise. The classification meant that a killer had walked the sands of Waipio Valley. A killer had meticulously dug a hole in the black sand, placed Matthew's lifeless body into the earth, and covered him up, hoping the ocean and the isolation of the valley would keep the secret forever. If not for a dog wandering the beach on a Tuesday afternoon, Matthew Joel Peak might have remained buried in the valley for eternity, his disappearance recorded merely as another young transient who simply drifted off the map. Instead, the discovery of his body ignited a desperate, sprawling investigation. The police now knew who the victim was, and they knew how he had died. But as they would soon discover, knowing the beginning and the end of Matthew's story was entirely different from understanding the middle. They were faced with the monumental task of retracing the chaotic, undocumented steps of a young hitchhiker who lived a life entirely off the grid. They had a body, a cause of death, and a crime scene. What they did not have, and what they would spend the next quarter of a century agonizingly searching for, was a suspect, a motive, and the truth about what really happened in the days leading up to June 1st, 1999. The story of Matthew Joel Peak is not just a story about a life cut brutally short. It is a haunting exploration of how easily a human being can vanish, how quickly trails can go cold, and how the vast, beautiful wilderness can become the perfect accomplice to murder. When we speak about a victim of a homicide, it is critically important to strip away the clinical terminology of police reports and autopsy documents to remember the fundamental human being at the center of the tragedy. Matthew Joel Peak was just 22 years old when his life was violently taken from him in the shadows of Waipio Valley. 22 is an age suspended in the delicate space between adolescence and true adulthood. It is a time characterized by exploration, by the shedding of childhood constraints, and by an innate, burning desire to figure out one's place in a vast and complicated world. At 22, most people are just beginning to write the opening chapters of their independent lives. They are making mistakes, testing boundaries, and dreaming about a future that feels entirely limitless. Matthew was right in the middle of this profound transition. He was a young man walking the earth, breathing the salt air of the Pacific, and searching for whatever it was that brought him to the rugged, awe-inspiring landscapes of the Big Island of Hawaii. When a life is extinguished at such a formative age, the loss is not just about the years that were lived, but about the decades that were stolen. Every potential milestone, every future relationship, every dream he might have realized was abruptly erased in a matter of terrifying moments. To understand the gravity of the Waipio Valley mystery, we must first deeply understand the kind of life Matthew was living in 1999, because his daily existence, his routines, and his choices are intrinsically linked to the immense difficulty investigators would face in trying to catch his killer. Matthew did not live a conventional life, and his departure from the norm is the key to understanding the profound silence that surrounds his death. According to the Hawaii Police Department, Matthew Peak was a resident of the island, but he did not adhere to the rigid structures that define most of our daily routines. He did not punch a clock at a 9-to-5 job, nor did he tether himself to a predictable, documented schedule. Instead, Matthew embraced a nomadic, transient lifestyle that was highly characteristic of the alternative culture prevalent on the Big Island during the late 90s. He was a wanderer, a young man who moved fluidly through the world without leaving a heavy footprint behind. This type of existence holds a deeply romantic appeal for many young people seeking freedom from societal expectations. It offers liberation from the mundane, allowing a person to exist entirely in the present moment, guided by the weather, the landscape, and a sense of spontaneous adventure. However, this profound detachment from mainstream society also creates an existence that is practically invisible to the bureaucratic systems that track the average citizen. Matthew did not leave behind a trail of credit card receipts at local coffee shops. He did not have a daily commute that could be verified by toll booths or security cameras. He did not have coworkers who would immediately notice his absence on a Tuesday morning. He lived off the grid, drifting through the lush, tropical environments of the island with a quiet anonymity. This anonymity, while perhaps intentionally sought after for the sake of personal freedom, would ultimately become the darkest and most impenetrable veil over his final days. When a person lives a life completely detached from standard routines, constructing a timeline of their movements becomes an arduous, almost impossible task for law enforcement. The most definitive detail investigators managed to confirm about Matthew's daily life was his primary method of transportation. Matthew was an avid hitchhiker. He relied entirely on the unpredictable kindness of strangers to navigate the sprawling, diverse landscapes of Hawaii Island. Police reports confirm that he was frequently seen thumbing for rides, heavily frequenting the areas around Hilo and the Puna district. Hilo, with its historic downtown and consistent rainfall, and Puna, known for its rugged volcanic coastlines, dense rainforests, and deeply ingrained counterculture, formed the primary backdrop of his transient existence. Hitchhiking was not uncommon in these districts in 1999. It was a recognized subculture, a mutually accepted method of transit in a rural landscape where public transportation was sparse and community trust was relatively high. For Matthew, standing on the shoulder of a two-lane highway with his thumb extended was a routine part of survival and exploration. He would wait by the asphalt as cars sped past, making split-second judgments about the vehicles that slowed down to offer a lift. Every time he climbed into the passenger seat of a passing car or the bed of a pickup truck, he was engaging in a silent, complex negotiation of trust. He was sharing a confined space with individuals whose backgrounds, intentions, and psychological states were entirely unknown to him. This constant movement between Hilo and Puna meant that Matthew was exposed to a vast, constantly rotating cast of characters. His social network was not confined to a stable group of friends or family, but rather it consisted of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of fleeting interactions with anonymous drivers. This exact mode of transportation highlights the extreme vulnerability of Matthew's lifestyle. While hitchhiking offers unparalleled freedom and mobility without financial cost, it inherently strips away every layer of personal security. When you enter a stranger's vehicle, you are willingly surrendering control over your environment, your destination, and your physical safety. The doors lock, the engine accelerates, and you are entirely at the mercy of the person behind the wheel. The psychology of hitchhiking relies on an optimistic belief in the inherent goodness of humanity, an assumption that the person offering a ride is doing so out of altruism rather than malice. Unfortunately, history and true crime archives are absolutely replete with horrific stories that prove this assumption can be a fatal miscalculation. Predators frequently use the open road as a hunting ground, seeking out individuals precisely like Matthew because they are isolated, vulnerable, and unlikely to be immediately reported missing. Furthermore, a hitchhiker leaves no paper trail. There is no ticket purchased, no license plate recorded, and no digital record of the journey. If a hitchhiker gets into the wrong car, they simply vanish into the ether. The conversation shared in the cab of that truck or the front seat of that sedan is witnessed by no one else. For a murder investigation, this presents a terrifying black hole of information. The detectives tasked with finding Matthew's killer had to confront the agonizing reality that the perpetrator could have been absolutely anyone who happened to be driving along the highways of Hilo or Puna on a given afternoon in the late spring of 1999. Beyond his movements along the highways, the details regarding where Matthew actually rested his head at night remain murky and fragmented. Within the local community, there were persistent whispers and unconfirmed reports suggesting that Matthew had been living in a temporary, makeshift shelter somewhere in the dense, unforgiving wilderness near the Waipio Valley area. It is vital to state clearly that the Hawaii Police Department has never officially included these specific details about a temporary shelter in their finalized, public summaries of the case. In the realm of unsolved homicides, one must tread incredibly carefully to separate verified investigative facts from local lore and community speculation. However, even as an unconfirmed detail, the rumor paints a poignant picture of how isolated his existence might have been. Living in a temporary shelter near a place as remote and rugged as Waipio Valley means enduring the elements, navigating steep, dangerous terrain, and existing far beyond the protective gaze of neighbors or a structured community. It implies a life of intense solitude, tucked away in the dense tropical foliage where the sounds of civilization are entirely swallowed by the roar of the ocean and the wind whipping through the valley walls. Whether he was sleeping in a makeshift camp or crashing in various temporary spots across the districts, the overarching truth remains exactly the same. Matthew was profoundly disconnected from the safety nets that typically monitor a person's well-being. There was no landlord to notice unpaid rent, no roommate to report a missing person, and no consistent location for police to establish as a definitive primary crime scene. We are left with a haunting image of a 22-year-old wanderer, trusting the open road, seeking freedom on the beautiful, unforgiving edges of the Big Island. His lifestyle was not a crime. It was simply a choice, a manifestation of youthful independence that tragically placed him directly in the crosshairs of a killer. The very attributes that defined Matthew's existence became the exact elements that allowed his murderer to slip away completely undetected. Matthew's vulnerability was weaponized against him. The person who stopped his breathing likely knew that this young man was alone in the world. Matthew Joel Peak was a human being who deserved a full life, but his off-the-grid existence provided a predator with the ultimate, tragic opportunity. The transition from a peaceful Tuesday afternoon to an active crime scene is always a jarring rupture in reality, but in a location as geographically isolated and stunningly beautiful as Waipio Valley, that rupture feels profoundly unnatural. At exactly 2:47 in the afternoon on June 1st, 1999, the Hawaii Police Department received the emergency dispatch that would initiate one of the most baffling cold cases in the island's history. Responding to a call in this specific valley is an immediate logistical nightmare for law enforcement, as the steep, plunging access road demands specialized four-wheel drive vehicles and careful navigation, meaning that the terror experienced by the beachgoers who discovered the human remains was prolonged as they waited for authorities to descend into the basin. When the first responding officers finally reached the remote expanse of black volcanic sand, they were confronted with a scene that starkly contrasted with the rhythmic, peaceful sound of the crashing Pacific surf. The area surrounding the disturbed mound of sand was immediately cordoned off with bright yellow crime scene tape, a vibrant and unnatural intrusion of authority against the muted, natural colors of the coastline, signaling to anyone present that the pristine sanctuary of the beach had been irrevocably violated by human malice. The initial assessment of the scene required an agonizingly slow and methodical approach, because every single grain of sand surrounding the grave was a potential vessel for microscopic evidence, demanding that the officers carefully document the immediate perimeter before fully exhuming the hidden nightmare beneath their boots. As the forensic technicians and investigators began the grim, delicate task of brushing away the heavy, dark sand to fully expose the hidden body, the true, horrifying extent of the victim's physical condition was gradually brought into the unforgiving light of the tropical sun. The remains pulled from the shallow grave were in a state of severe, advanced decomposition, a horrific biological reality accelerated by the brutal environmental conditions of a coastal burial where extreme heat, corrosive moisture, and teeming insect activity work rapidly to dismantle the human form. This severe level of decay immediately presented the investigators with a catastrophic investigative hurdle because it meant that the victim had been stripped of their most fundamental human characteristic, their face, rendering any immediate visual identification at the crime scene entirely and permanently impossible. The investigators were not looking at a person they could readily recognize or describe to the media. They were looking at an anonymous casualty of extreme violence, a nameless John Doe whose physical identity had been consumed by the earth, leaving behind only an agonizing biological puzzle for the medical examiners to eventually decode. The meticulously extracted remains were respectfully secured in a heavy transport bag, lifting the victim from the dark sand that was intended to be a permanent, secret tomb and beginning the long, somber journey out of the valley walls. The transition from the sprawling, untamed wilderness of Waipio Valley to the sterile, heavily regulated environment of the Hilo Medical Center morgue represents the crucial shift from field investigation to clinical forensic science, a space where biology and pathology are rigorously interrogated to speak for those who have been violently silenced. Inside the morgue, under the harsh, unforgiving glare of fluorescent lights, the autopsy process began with a profound sense of urgency as the forensic pathologist faced the dual, monumental tasks of figuring out who this person was and precisely how their life had been prematurely extinguished. The total inability to rely on facial features or distinct physical characteristics meant that the medical examiner had to depend entirely on the immutable scientific markers of the human body, turning their focused attention to the hands of the deceased in a desperate search for answers. Through a painstaking, highly specialized process, the forensic team managed to recover viable fingerprints from the badly decomposed remains, an extraordinary feat of forensic resilience that provided the first glimmer of hope in piercing the absolute darkness surrounding the victim's identity. These recovered prints were meticulously processed and subsequently run through the law enforcement databases, an agonizing period of anticipation for the detectives who desperately needed a name to anchor their sprawling, directionless investigation into a tangible human life. When the database finally returned a conclusive match, the anonymous John Doe officially reclaimed his identity, transforming from a tragic, faceless victim into a 22-year-old young man named Matthew Joel Peak, forever altering the trajectory of the investigation by giving the detectives a specific life to retrospectively untangle. Knowing the name of the victim is the foundational bedrock of any homicide investigation because it allows law enforcement to begin tracing the victim's final footsteps, interviewing their known associates, and mapping their habitual geographical movements across the island in the days leading up to their tragic demise. However, discovering the identity of Matthew Joel Peak was merely the opening revelation of the autopsy, because the forensic pathologist still had to determine the precise biological mechanism that had caused this young man to cease living. A determination that would ultimately dictate the entire legal and investigative nature of the police response. The physical examination of a severely decomposed body is an incredibly complex pathological endeavor, as the natural processes of decay actively destroy the very cellular evidence that investigators desperately need to reconstruct the final, violent moments of the victim's life. Despite the catastrophic degradation of the bodily tissues, the medical examiner conducted a highly rigorous internal and external evaluation of Matthew's remains, searching for broken bones, defensive wounds, ballistic trajectories, or any other structural anomalies that could explain his presence in a shallow, sandy grave. What the pathologist ultimately discovered was not a gunshot wound, nor was it the massive blunt force trauma associated with a tragic fall from the towering cliffs surrounding the valley, but rather something far more intimate, terrifying, and deeply intentional. The official autopsy report, later confirmed and disseminated by the Hawaii Police Department, unequivocally concluded that the primary cause of death for Matthew Joel Peak was asphyxia, a stark and chilling medical term that translates into the horrifying reality of fatal oxygen deprivation. Asphyxia indicates that the mechanical process of breathing was deliberately and forcibly stopped, meaning that Matthew did not succumb to a natural medical emergency or an accidental drowning in the treacherous Pacific currents, but rather he was subjected to a lethal restriction of his airway. The determination of asphyxia completely eliminates the possibility of an accidental demise because it requires the active, physical intervention of another human being applying sustained, lethal pressure, either through manual strangulation, the use of a ligature, or some other method of forced suffocation. This specific method of killing is inherently personal and physically demanding, requiring the perpetrator to be in extremely close proximity to their victim, looking into their eyes, and maintaining a terrifying degree of physical control until the absolute cessation of life is achieved. The medical realization that a young, healthy 22-year-old man had the very breath squeezed from his lungs transformed the narrative of the case from a mysterious, tragic discovery into an active, urgent hunt for a dangerous and cold-blooded predator walking the streets of the island. Based entirely on the definitive, incontrovertible medical evidence of fatal asphyxiation, the forensic pathologist and the Hawaii Police Department officially classified the tragic death of Matthew Joel Peak as a homicide, formally setting the bureaucratic and investigative machinery of a murder hunt into full, irreversible motion. This official homicide classification meant that every resource, every available detective, and every forensic tool would be dedicated to finding the individual who had deliberately stolen the future from a young man who was merely wandering the expansive, beautiful roads of the Big Island. The realization that this was a calculated murder added a sinister, heavy atmosphere to the stunning vistas of Waipio Valley, effectively transforming one of the most sacred, culturally significant, and visually arresting locations in the entire state of Hawaii into a chilling crime scene harboring a dark, unresolved secret. The killer did not simply walk away after extinguishing Matthew's life. They took the deliberate, physically exhausting, and highly risky secondary step of digging a grave in the heavy volcanic sand, attempting to permanently erase their horrific crime by hiding the victim's body in a place where they believed no one would ever look. This act of concealment demonstrates a chilling level of criminal awareness and a desperate, calculated desire for self-preservation, proving that the perpetrator fully understood the immense gravity of their actions and actively sought to manipulate the remote environment to ensure their own continued freedom. The severe decomposition of the body, while devastating for the immediate recovery of standard forensic evidence, also indicated that the killer's plan had initially been incredibly successful. As Matthew had laid undiscovered in the sand for a significant period before the sheer chance of a wandering dog finally brought his brutal murder to the attention of the authorities. The murder remains unsolved to this very day. The immediate aftermath of identifying Matthew Joel Peak and determining asphyxiation as the cause of death propelled the Hawaii Police Department into a labyrinthine investigation defined by agonizing physical and logistical paradoxes. Detectives first had to meticulously deconstruct the psychological and geographical implications of the killer's decision to conceal the body beneath the black sands of Waipio Valley. Burying a human being is an intensely physically demanding endeavor that requires significant time, sustained exertion, and a profound degree of environmental awareness, especially in an area exposed to shifting tides and wandering beachgoers. This calculated act of concealment immediately presented investigators with two distinct, equally troubling spatial theories regarding the exact primary crime scene. The first theory posited that the violent asphyxiation occurred right there on the secluded shoreline, suggesting that Matthew had traveled into the valley with his eventual killer, perhaps under the guise of companionship or a promised ride, only to be overpowered in the sand. If the murder happened on the beach, the killer would have had to frantically dig the grave in the immediate aftermath of the struggle, constantly scanning the expansive horizon for any approaching locals or tourists who might witness the frantic burial. The second, far more logistically complex theory suggested that Matthew was murdered at a completely different, undisclosed location somewhere else on the island, and his lifeless body was subsequently transported into the valley strictly for the purpose of permanent disposal. This second scenario introduces a terrifying level of premeditation and risk because transporting a deceased adult male down the notoriously treacherous, incredibly steep access road into Waipio Valley would require a reliable four-wheel drive vehicle and an astonishing degree of cold-blooded nerve. Navigating that specific cliffside road is dangerous under the best of circumstances. But doing so while concealing a murder victim in the trunk or the bed of a truck demonstrates a perpetrator who is highly familiar with the isolated terrain and absolutely determined to use the valley's remoteness as a geographical accomplice. Regardless of whichever specific spatial theory was factually true, the undeniable reality remained that the killer deliberately chose a location that maximized isolation and minimized the risk of immediate discovery. A strategy that unfortunately proved incredibly effective given the advanced state of the remains. Once the geographical puzzle of the burial site was established, detectives were forced to confront the seemingly impossible task of working backward to reconstruct the final, undocumented days of Matthew's life. In a standard homicide investigation, detectives rely heavily on the victim's routine to establish a timeline, pulling employment records, checking bank statements, reviewing security camera footage, and interviewing a stable network of colleagues and close friends. However, Matthew's deeply entrenched lifestyle as a transient hitchhiker who frequently moved between the Hilo and Puna districts completely obliterated these traditional investigative safety nets, leaving law enforcement grasping at shadows. Because he did not adhere to a structured daily schedule, there was no definitive moment when a boss or a roommate noticed he was missing, meaning the exact date of his disappearance could not be firmly established by those who knew him. Investigators had to canvass the vast, sprawling roadways of the eastern and southern coastlines, desperately searching for anyone who might recall offering a ride to a 22-year-old wanderer in late May of 1999. This endeavor was akin to searching for a ghost in a hurricane, because a hitchhiker interacts with a constantly rotating, entirely anonymous cast of vehicular passing strangers who leave absolutely no paper trail or digital footprint. Every single driver who traversed the highways of Hilo and Puna during that vague window of time was technically a potential witness, or horrifyingly, a potential suspect. But isolating these individuals without license plate numbers or specific vehicle descriptions was practically an exercise in futility. Furthermore, the transient culture of the area meant that many of the people Matthew might have interacted with were themselves nomadic, living off the grid, and deeply distrustful of law enforcement inquiries, creating a heavy wall of silence around his final movements. The police were forced to rely on the notoriously fragile and subjective nature of human memory, asking locals to reach back through weeks of mundane daily driving to recall a fleeting, temporary passenger who likely seemed entirely insignificant at the time. A driver might casually remember picking up a young man, but recalling the specific date, the exact drop-off location, or any distinct behavioral nuances that could aid a murder investigation proved to be an insurmountable hurdle that continuously stalled the momentum of the detectives. Compounding the absolute lack of a verifiable timeline was the devastating reality that the harsh, unforgiving coastal environment of Waipio Valley had systematically destroyed the most critical forensic evidence that typically points toward a killer. When a body is subjected to severe, advanced decomposition, the biological markers that medical examiners rely upon to establish a precise time of death are entirely eradicated, leaving investigators with an unhelpfully broad window of days, or even weeks during which the murder could have occurred. This inability to pinpoint the exact hour or day of death made it virtually impossible to cross-reference potential suspect alibis, because a suspect cannot be cleared or implicated if the police cannot definitively state when the crime actually took place. Furthermore, the violent nature of fatal asphyxiation usually involves a desperate, close-quarters physical struggle, an intimate combat that typically leaves crucial biological trace evidence transferred between the victim and the perpetrator. In a pristine forensic scenario, detectives would hope to find the killer's skin cells trapped beneath the victim's fingernails from defensive scratching or stray hairs, or other microscopic biological material that could eventually yield a definitive DNA profile. However, the corrosive combination of abrasive volcanic sand, extreme tropical heat, relentless humidity, and the natural biological processes of decay completely sanitized the remains of these vital, microscopic clues. The natural earth itself acted as a silent, unwitting accomplice to the ruthless murderer, breaking down the cellular structures that could have provided a genetic map leading directly to the person responsible for the crime. Without a murder weapon left behind, without any recovered DNA from a struggle, and without any identifiable fibers or foreign materials clinging to the victim, the crime scene at the beach offered zero actionable physical leads to propel the case forward. The detectives were trapped in a forensic vacuum where the only absolute scientific certainty they possessed was the mechanism of death, leaving them completely blind to the physical identity of the person who had applied the lethal force. As weeks bled into months, the investigation inevitably began to suffer from the cascading effects of geographic isolation and the rapid deterioration of actionable intelligence within the local community. Waipio Valley is profoundly detached from the modern surveillance infrastructure that often aids contemporary law enforcement, meaning there were absolutely no security cameras recording the vehicles entering or exiting the steep access road during the critical time frame. There were no digital cell phone tower pings to track the geographic coordinates of the victim or the killer, because the technology of 1999 was far less ubiquitous, and the valley itself is a notorious dead zone for any sort of wireless communication signal. Investigators were entirely dependent on traditional, boots-on-the-ground detective work, knocking on doors, distributing composite sketches, and pleading with the public through local media outlets for any fragmented piece of information. Yet, despite their relentless efforts, the leads generated by these public appeals were consistently vague, contradictory, or entirely unrelated to the tragic fate of Matthew Joel Peak, leading the detectives down a series of agonizingly frustrating dead ends. The few individuals who did come forward with potential sightings could never provide the concrete, verifiable details necessary to secure a search warrant or justify bringing a person of interest into the interrogation room. The terrifying reality began to settle over the police department that the killer had executed a nearly flawless crime, utilizing the victim's nomadic lifestyle to avoid immediate detection and leveraging the immense, brutal geography of the island to swallow the physical evidence. The detectives knew unequivocally that a violent predator was responsible for the asphyxiation, but they were staring at a blank suspect board, crippled by the lack of witnesses, the absence of forensics, and the silent, enduring walls of the valley. The sheer magnitude of these combined obstacles created an impenetrable barrier to criminal justice, forcing law enforcement to repeatedly revisit the exact same sparse files without uncovering any new, actionable threads to pull. The investigation into the death of Matthew Joel Peak gradually transformed from a fast-paced, urgent manhunt into a haunting, static cold case, paralyzed by an environment that refused to yield its deepest secrets and a killer who had successfully vanished completely into the humid, tropical ether. Society is deeply conditioned to expect a specific, highly structured resolution when a horrific crime is committed against an innocent person. We rely heavily on the familiar narrative arc of the criminal justice system, a definitive sequence of events that provides a sense of moral equilibrium and societal safety. We expect the diligent, tireless investigation by law enforcement to inevitably yield a prime suspect, followed by the dramatic, public closure of handcuffs clicking into place, the reading of constitutional rights, and the heavy steel doors of a holding cell sliding definitively shut. We anticipate the adversarial theater of a courtroom, where forensic evidence is meticulously presented to a jury of peers, where seasoned prosecutors and defense attorneys argue passionately over the minutiae of the legal code, and where a judge ultimately hands down a severe sentence that accurately reflects the immense gravity of the extinguished life. This comprehensive legal process, culminating in a definitive verdict and a formal period of long-term incarceration, is exactly how we process collective trauma and restore our fundamental belief in a just world. But for Matthew Joel Peak, this entire complex structure of legal reckoning and moral balancing simply never materialized. There was no heavy wooden gavel strike echoing through a hushed, tense courtroom to mark the definitive end of his tragic narrative. There were no emotional witness testimonies detailing the precise timeline of his final, terrifying hours on the island. There was no suspect sitting quietly at the defense table, forced by the state to listen to the gruesome, highly clinical details of the autopsy report that outlined the brutal mechanics of fatal asphyxiation. The devastating reality of the 1999 Waipio Valley murder is defined entirely by the profound, deafening silence of an empty courtroom and an empty suspect chair. The justice system, deliberately designed to balance the scales of morality, was completely paralyzed by the sheer lack of actionable intelligence, leaving Matthew's case permanently suspended in an agonizing state of unresolved legal purgatory. Instead of a high-profile trial that brings a dangerous killer into the harsh light of public scrutiny, the true trial of this case was endured silently and painfully by the investigators who were forced to navigate a sprawling labyrinth of absolute dead ends. Behind the closed doors of the Hawaii Police Department, the investigation into Matthew's death gradually became a grueling, heartbreaking exercise in professional frustration and psychological endurance. Detectives are naturally driven by a relentless, consuming desire to close the loop on a homicide, to answer the fundamental human questions of who, how, and why, but this specific investigation actively resisted every single standard methodology they aggressively deployed. They chased down every vague, unsubstantiated rumor that floated through the transient, off-the-grid communities of the Hilo and Puna districts, dedicating countless hours to locating individuals who might have shared a brief conversation or a passing glance with a young hitchhiker in the days before he vanished. They pulled extensive files on known violent offenders and local predators in the area, attempting to find any behavioral similarities or overlapping geographical movements that could suggest a viable, compelling person of interest. They repeatedly and obsessively reviewed the scarce forensic data recovered from the severely decomposed remains, hoping that advanced, modern interpretations might suddenly reveal a microscopic clue that the initial assessments had somehow tragically overlooked. Yet, every single promising avenue of investigative inquiry eventually terminated at an impenetrable brick wall of silence and circumstance. Individuals who initially seemed highly promising as potential witnesses quickly dissolved under intense scrutiny, their memories proving far too fragile, clouded, and inconsistent to support the heavy, rigorous burden of a formal murder investigation. The standard process of eliminating leads is normally a highly productive method of narrowing the suspect pool toward a singular target, but in this profoundly isolated case, the systematic elimination of leads simply emptied the board entirely, leaving the exhausted detectives staring at a terrifyingly blank space where a murderer's identity should have been definitively established. The most defining, unusual, and deeply unsettling characteristic of the Waipio Valley murder is the stark, undeniable fact that the authorities never publicly identified a single credible suspect throughout the entirety of the investigation. In many high-profile, unsolved homicides, law enforcement agencies will often have a very strong, heavily guarded internal suspicion regarding the exact identity of the perpetrator, but they simply lack the definitive, incontrovertible physical evidence required by a strict district attorney to secure a successful conviction beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. In those highly frustrating scenarios, a specific name might quietly circulate within the homicide department, and detectives might keep a persistent, watchful eye on a particular individual, waiting patiently for them to make a crucial tactical mistake or for rapid advancements in forensic technology to finally bridge the agonizing evidentiary gap. However, the official, documented narrative surrounding the tragic death of Matthew Joel Peak contains absolutely no such designated target. The police department was completely deprived of the investigative luxury of a primary suspect to relentlessly pursue. There was no bitter, vengeful former companion harboring a documented grudge, no complex financial motive tying a specific, greedy beneficiary to his sudden demise, and no historical pattern of localized, escalating violence that pointed directly toward a known, repeat criminal offender living in the area. The killer seemingly emerged from the vast, anonymous shadows of the island's landscape, committed an act of supreme, calculated brutality that required immense physical effort, and then seamlessly retreated back into the impenetrable darkness without leaving a single identifiable trace of their existence. The complete and utter absence of an arrest means that the surrounding community was forced to grapple with a chilling, abstract fear. The horrifying realization that a monster capable of strangling a 22-year-old boy and burying his body in the heavy sand was entirely unknown to the very authorities tasked with protecting the public. This total lack of legal resolution forces society to confront a deeply uncomfortable and terrifying psychological reality regarding the perpetrator who committed this atrocity. Because no one was ever brought to trial, and because no one was ever publicly accused of the crime, the person who violently stole the breath from Matthew Joel Peak has lived out the ensuing 2.5 decades in absolute, unencumbered freedom. The killer did not spend the turn of the new millennium locked inside a bleak, concrete cell, isolated from the outside world as a direct consequence of their horrific, irreversible actions. Instead, they walked freely under the exact same tropical sun, breathing the exact same coastal air, and potentially interacting with the exact same local community that Matthew had once wandered through during his transient adventures. The killer might have routinely driven past the very police station where dedicated, exhausted detectives were agonizing over the stalled, frustrating investigation files. They might have integrated themselves seamlessly and invisibly into normal, everyday society, hiding their monstrous capability behind the mundane, unremarkable facade of a regular life, holding down a standard job, maintaining personal relationships, and projecting an aura of completely unremarkable normalcy to everyone they encountered. The terrifying success of their calculated crime means they never faced the intense, public scrutiny of a ruthless cross-examination. They never had their violent nature publicly exposed to the world, and they never answered to any mortal, legal authority for the catastrophic, permanent damage they inflicted upon a young man's life and the community at large. The fact that this specific individual could commit such a physically demanding, intimately violent act of murder and then simply walk away without facing a single legal consequence shatters the fundamental, comforting illusion that the universe inherently bends toward justice. The killer successfully transformed into a phantom, a highly dangerous, invisible entity drifting quietly through the passing decades, carrying the heavy, dark secret of the Waipio Valley burial entirely in the deep, silent recesses of their own mind. Eventually, the relentless, unforgiving passage of time and the absolute, total exhaustion of all available investigative leads forced a necessary, albeit deeply painful and demoralizing, administrative transition within the police department structure. An investigation simply cannot remain indefinitely in a highly active, resource-intensive priority status when there are absolutely no new investigative threads left to pull, no new potential witnesses to thoroughly interview, and no new scientific forensic avenues left to explore. The initial, intense flurry of desperate detective work that characterized the months following the discovery of the body gradually subsided, eventually replaced by the grim, highly bureaucratic reality of a permanently stalled investigation. The massive, heavy binders containing the disturbing crime scene photographs, the devastating and clinical autopsy reports, and the endless, depressing logs of entirely fruitless witness interviews were carefully organized, boxed up, and officially transferred to the department's archives. The official, legal status of the Matthew Joel Peak investigation was formally changed by the Hawaii Police Department to an unsolved homicide and officially designated as a cold case, a chilling classification that signifies both a tragic, undeniable failure of the justice system and a stubborn, enduring refusal by law enforcement to completely close the book on the victim's life. Moving a thick investigative file to the dedicated cold case unit does not mean that the police department has simply given up or completely forgotten about the horrific fate of the victim, but rather it serves as a heartbreaking acknowledgement that the case has officially entered a state of indefinite, frustrating hibernation, waiting patiently for a miraculous external catalyst to suddenly jolt it back to active life. The file sits silently on a shelf, representing a permanent, unresolved blemish on the history of the beautiful island, serving as a constant, heavy reminder of the young, adventurous man who went to the spectacular black sand beach and never returned to the world of the living. The comprehensive trial that Matthew Joel Peak so deeply deserved was completely replaced by a permanent, agonizing state of legal and investigative limbo, where the only final verdict ever delivered was a crushing, enduring silence that continues to echo through the steep, beautiful cliffs of the remote valley to this very day. The passage of a quarter of a century is a profound and terrifying metric when applied to the lifespan of an unsolved murder investigation. 25 years represents a generational shift, a vast expanse of time during which the entire surrounding world undergoes massive, unrecognizable transformations while the frozen, tragic reality of the crime scene remains entirely static, permanently locked in the amber of a police file. Since the tragic afternoon of June 1, 1999, the world has crossed the threshold into a new millennium. Technology has fundamentally rewired the way human beings communicate and track one another, and the local communities of the Big Island have naturally evolved, expanded, and changed. The tourists who visited the breathtaking expanses of Waipio Valley on that fateful summer day have grown old, moved on with their lives, and likely forgotten the minor details of their Hawaiian vacation, completely unaware of the dark shadow they walked past on the black sand beach. Yet, amidst all of this relentless societal and environmental progression, the brutal reality of what happened to Matthew Joel Peak remains entirely unchanged, a permanent, gaping wound in the history of the island. When we analyze the timeline of this case, we are forced to confront a devastating, heartbreaking mathematical reality that underscores the absolute cruelty of his murder. Matthew was merely 22 years old when his life was violently extinguished by a stranger in the sand. Today, as this case continues to languish in the cold case archives, Matthew has officially been dead longer than he was ever allowed to be alive. The years he spent wandering, learning, and experiencing the world have now been entirely eclipsed by the agonizing decades he has spent waiting for a justice that seems perpetually out of reach. All the potential milestones of a normal human life, the aging process, the establishing of roots, the natural evolution of his youthful wanderlust into adult stability, were permanently stolen from him in a matter of desperate, terrifying moments. The crushing weight of this lost time is heavily felt by the detectives who occasionally pull his dusty file from the archives, knowing that with every single passing calendar year, the statistical probability of identifying the person who choked the life out of this young man diminishes. As memories fade, biological evidence degrades even further into absolute nothingness, and potential witnesses slowly pass away, taking their unshared, silent observations with them to the grave. Despite the monumental, corrosive effect of time on a cold case, the law enforcement agencies tasked with protecting the public completely refused to surrender to the apathy of the passing decades, utilizing milestone anniversaries as a powerful, strategic tool to violently jolt the public consciousness back to a forgotten tragedy. On August 29, 2024, the Hawaii Police Department made a deliberate, calculated administrative decision to publicly highlight the unsolved status of the Waipio Valley murder, officially pushing the case file back into the spotlight by relisting Matthew Joel Peak in their active registry of unresolved homicides. This administrative maneuver was not merely a bureaucratic housekeeping task, but rather a desperate, tactical plea designed to lay the necessary groundwork for a massive, coordinated media resurgence the following year. In 2025, marking exactly 25 years since the horrific discovery of the heavily decomposed remains by a wandering dog, local media outlets, including prominent broadcasts by KHON2 and widespread digital syndication through Yahoo News, actively pushed the gruesome details of the 1999 murder back onto the screens and into the living rooms of the public. This strategic media saturation is a deeply psychological investigative technique built entirely upon the fundamental understanding of how the human brain processes, stores, and eventually recalls seemingly insignificant, passive memories. Detectives fully understand that they are no longer searching for a smoking gun or a sudden, miraculous DNA match that will effortlessly solve the mystery in a vacuum. Instead, they are desperately hunting for a microscopic, forgotten fragment of human experience, banking on the hope that a sudden media broadcast might act as a psychological catalyst, triggering a buried memory in the mind of someone who was present on the Big Island during the late spring of 1999. The police are relying heavily on the butterfly effect of memory, the profound idea that a completely innocuous observation made decades ago could suddenly become the critical, missing keystone that instantly causes the entire invisible structure of the killer's alibi to collapse. What the authorities are asking the public to search for within their own minds is not a dramatic, cinematic recollection of a violent murder in progress, but rather the mundane, peripheral details of daily life that suddenly take on a sinister, monumental importance when placed within the context of a homicide investigation. They are desperately hoping that a former resident of the Hilo or Puna districts, perhaps someone who themselves lived a transient, off-the-grid lifestyle during the late 90s, might suddenly remember picking up a 22-year-old hitchhiker matching Matthew's description in late May. They are hoping someone might recall a highly unusual, out-of-place vehicle parked recklessly near the incredibly steep, treacherous access road leading down into Waipio Valley during those critical days before the body was discovered. They are praying that a bartender, a gas station attendant, or a local shop owner might suddenly remember a brief, seemingly normal conversation with a young man who subsequently vanished, or perhaps more importantly, they might recall a regular customer who exhibited sudden, highly erratic, unexplained behavior, or someone who abruptly and inexplicably packed up their entire life and fled the island immediately following the 1st of June. In the realm of cold case investigations, a single, solitary detail, a faded mental image of a specific bumper sticker, a remembered nickname, a sudden realization about a former acquaintance's unexplained absence can instantly reignite a dormant investigation, transforming a cold file into an active, burning pursuit of a living, breathing suspect. The deeply unsettling reality that the police must convey to the public is that the key to solving the brutal asphyxiation of Matthew Joel Peak is likely currently sitting quietly inside the mind of a person who has absolutely no conscious realization that they hold the most important piece of evidence in a decades-old murder trial. The monumental challenge is reaching that specific individual, piercing through the heavy fog of 25 years of accumulated life experiences and convincing them to finally step forward out of the shadows to share that tiny, brilliant fragment of truth with the authorities. As we reflect on the totality of this baffling, tragic narrative, we are forced to sit with a deeply uncomfortable, haunting truth regarding the fundamental nature of criminal justice and the terrifying capabilities of human beings. The absolute lack of a named suspect, the complete absence of an arrest, and the permanently empty courtroom mean that the person who committed this atrocity has completely escaped the massive, retributive weight of the law. Walking away from the pristine black sands of Waipio Valley with the ultimate, horrifying victory of absolute impunity. The killer has been granted the immense, unearned privilege of living out the rest of their natural life, experiencing all the joys, sorrows, and mundane moments of human existence that they deliberately, violently stole from a 22-year-old wanderer. They have watched the world change, they have aged, and they have existed within the community, carrying the heavy, rotting secret of the shallow grave entirely within the dark recesses of their own psychology. It is a profoundly disturbing realization that the individual responsible for manually stopping the breath of Matthew Joel Peak could be absolutely anyone, a seemingly normal neighbor, a friendly face passing on the street, or a stranger sitting quietly in a local diner. Hiding an unspeakable history of supreme violence behind a carefully constructed facade of ordinary life. This total absence of accountability creates a lingering, heavy atmosphere of unease that permanently taints the breathtaking, majestic beauty of the valley, reminding us that even in the most isolated, idyllic, and sacred corners of the natural world, the darkest, most predatory elements of human nature can successfully strike and then seamlessly vanish into the ether, leaving behind nothing but grief and an enduring, painful mystery. The story of Matthew Joel Peak is not merely a historical true crime anecdote. It is an active, open, and bleeding wound on the conscience of the community, a stark reminder of the fragile nature of life and the terrifying ease with which a person can be completely erased from the face of the earth. Ultimately, the responsibility of finding justice for this young man no longer rests solely on the exhausted shoulders of the detectives who have repeatedly scoured the barren files, but rather it transitions outward, falling heavily upon the collective memory of the public at large. True crime is not simply entertainment. It is an active, urgent call for societal vigilance and a desperate plea for the truth to finally be brought into the unforgiving light of day. If you or anyone you know lived in, visited, or traveled through the Hilo, Puna, or Waipio Valley areas of the Big Island of Hawaii during the late spring of 1999, you are implored to search the deep archives of your own memory for anything that might seem even tangentially related to a young, transient hitchhiker or unusual activity near the valley cliffs. Even the most seemingly insignificant, minuscule detail, a forgotten conversation, a strange vehicle, a passing face on a rural highway, could be the exact vital catalyst required to finally tear down the impenetrable wall of silence that has protected a ruthless killer for more than 2.5 decades. The Hawaii Police Department maintains an active, open line of communication for any information regarding the unsolved homicide of Matthew Joel Peak. Waiting patiently for the single phone call that could finally balance the scales of justice and provide a definitive ending to this tragic narrative. Matthew cannot speak for himself. His voice was permanently stolen in the black sands of the valley, which means it is entirely up to the living to fiercely advocate for his memory and to ensure that the person who took his life does not get to keep their dark secret forever. Until that crucial piece of information surfaces, the incredibly beautiful, isolated expanse of Waipio Valley will continue to hold its breath, serving as a majestic, silent monument to a 22-year-old wanderer who went looking for freedom on the edge of the world, only to find a terrifying, permanent darkness from which he has never returned. There is a profound and unsettling psychological burden that accompanies any narrative lacking a definitive conclusion, a heavy cognitive dissonance that is magnified exponentially when that narrative involves the brutal, calculated termination of a human life. Human beings are inherently driven by an innate, almost biological need for closure, a deeply ingrained desire to see the chaotic, terrifying elements of our existence neatly organized into a coherent structure where malicious actions face immediate consequences and profound moral imbalances are ultimately rectified by the heavy, authoritative hand of justice. When a murder is committed, a catastrophic tear is violently ripped through the fundamental fabric of societal safety, and the resulting police investigation, trial, and eventual conviction serve as the necessary, collective stitches required to meticulously mend that psychological wound. However, in the agonizing, shadow-filled realm of cold cases, and specifically in the haunting, completely unresolved tragedy of Matthew Joel Peak, those critical stitches are entirely absent, leaving the wound permanently exposed to the corrosive, indifferent elements of passing time. An unsolved homicide is not merely an administrative failure safely documented and contained within a dusty police archive. It is a living, breathing entity that continues to silently terrorize the collective consciousness of a community, a persistent, whispering reminder that the structured legal safeguards we rely upon are inherently fragile and sometimes entirely ineffective. For well over 2.5 decades, the narrative surrounding the 1999 Waipio Valley murder has been defined not by answers or accountability, but by a deafening, enduring silence, a massive, terrifying void where justice was supposed to definitively reside. This complete lack of closure forces society to exist in a permanent state of unresolved grief and lingering paranoia, recognizing that the violent disruption of the natural moral order was never corrected. The story of this 22-year-old hitchhiker does not offer the comforting, traditional arc of a resolved true crime broadcast, but rather it demands that we confront the terrifying reality of the unknown, forcing us to look directly into the abyss of a perfect, unpunished crime and acknowledge the severe limitations of our human institutions in the face of calculated, brutal anonymity. To fully comprehend the enduring tragedy of this specific investigation, one must continuously return to the awe-inspiring, intimidating geographical theater where the nightmare originally unfolded, because the physical landscape of Waipio Valley is inextricably linked to the absolute, terrifying success of the perpetrator. The valley is a place of ancient, towering majesty, a remote, sacred sanctuary carved deep into the northern coast of the Big Island of Hawaii, completely defined by its plunging, emerald green cliffs and the relentless, deafening rhythm of the vast Pacific Ocean crashing violently against the dark, volcanic shoreline. It is a location that naturally inspires a sense of profound peace and deep spiritual connection, drawing wanderers, seekers, and independent free spirits who wish to temporarily sever their ties to the chaotic, hyper-connected modern world. Yet, this exact same breathtaking isolation, this extreme physical detachment from the watchful, protective eyes of organized society, was masterfully and ruthlessly weaponized by a predator to deliberately conceal an act of supreme, intimate violence. The Black Sand Beach, a beautiful, natural wonder created by centuries of violent volcanic activity and slow oceanic erosion, was brutally repurposed into a hasty, shallow grave, temporarily transforming the majestic valley into a silent, unwitting accomplice to a horrific murder. When we visualize the scene of the crime, we must actively contrast the incredible, timeless beauty of the Hawaiian coastal environment with the sudden, frantic, and deeply malicious human activity required to bury a violently asphyxiated young man in the heavy, wet sand. The earth eventually yielded its terrible, decomposing secret, not through the diligent, highly technological efforts of a sophisticated law enforcement search grid, but entirely through the random, primal, instinctual digging of a passing dog on a perfectly normal Tuesday afternoon. This stark, chilling contrast between the serene, completely indifferent beauty of the natural world and the gruesome, violent realities of extreme human behavior creates a deeply unsettling atmosphere that permanently shadows the valley, reminding every subsequent visitor that beneath the pristine, sun-baked surface of paradise, Dark and terrible secrets can remain completely hidden for decades, completely untouched by the crashing waves and the passing tropical storms. At the absolute center of this sprawling, unresolved geographical and legal puzzle remains the tragic, permanently silenced figure of Matthew Joel Peak. A young man whose boundless potential and innocent thirst for personal freedom were violently and permanently halted before they could truly begin to flourish into full adulthood. Matthew's purposefully chosen lifestyle as a transient wanderer, navigating the winding, rural roads of the Hilo and Puna districts entirely by the unpredictable, fleeting grace of passing strangers, paints a vivid, poignant picture of a deeply trusting, adventurous spirit operating far outside the rigid, conventional, and heavily documented structures of late 20th century society. This extreme, daily vulnerability, this complete, necessary reliance on the inherent goodness of anonymous drivers, was the defining, foundational characteristic of his daily existence, and tragically, it was the exact social mechanism that almost certainly delivered him directly into the dangerous, waiting hands of his executioner. The absolute anonymity that hitchhiking inherently provides, the total, frustrating lack of paper trails, fixed work schedules, or permanent digital footprints, created an impenetrable, heavy shroud of mystery surrounding his final, unrecorded days, making it completely impossible for desperate, exhausted investigators to accurately retrace his final, fatal journey toward the isolated northern coast. But the most chilling, inescapable, and haunting detail of Matthew's untimely demise is not simply the logistical fact that he vanished, but precisely the biological manner in which his life was intentionally and forcibly taken from him. The definitive, clinical autopsy finding of fatal asphyxiation completely strips away any comforting, protective illusions of a quick, accidental, or emotionally detached death, forcing anyone examining the case to confront the horrific, deeply intimate brutality of his final conscious moments on Earth. Asphyxiation requires a terrifying, sustained degree of physical proximity, immense exertion, and an absolute, cold-blooded commitment to successfully extinguishing another human being's existence. Meaning the killer had to look directly into the eyes of a 22-year-old boy and actively choose, second by agonizing second, to continue applying lethal, restrictive force until Matthew's desperate struggle permanently ceased. This was not a crime of sudden distance or clinical detachment. It was a deeply personal, physically demanding act of ultimate malice, a profound violation of humanity that ended a young life and left behind a severely decomposed, initially faceless casualty to be discovered by sheer
horrifying accident.
The ultimate, most terrifying historical legacy of the 1999 Waipio Valley murder is the enduring, entirely undisputed freedom of the unknown individual who successfully executed this horrific act of violence and successfully evaded the entire, massive apparatus of the criminal justice system. Because the Hawaii Police Department was never able to publicly identify a single primary suspect, secure a legal arrest warrant, or present a compelling, evidence-based case to a jury of local peers, the killer effectively became a phantom, a highly dangerous, totally invisible entity who simply dissolved seamlessly back into the general population without ever facing a single, solitary legal consequence. This anonymous person, entirely capable of intimately suffocating a healthy young man and subsequently burying his heavy, lifeless body in the coastal sand to avoid immediate detection, has been allowed to navigate the ensuing 25 years with absolute, unimpeded, and entirely unearned liberty. They have had the incredible, stolen privilege of watching the decades unfold, experiencing the vast, complex spectrum of human emotions, building personal relationships, and moving freely through the modern world while carrying the dark, suffocating, and rotting knowledge of their own monstrous capability entirely hidden within the silent recesses of their own mind. The psychological weight of this realization is incredibly heavy for the surrounding Hawaiian community and the dedicated, frustrated investigators who continue to manage the aging cold case files, because it completely shatters the fundamental, comforting societal promise that violent, dangerous predators will eventually be identified, isolated, and appropriately punished. The killer could be completely anonymous, living quietly and harmlessly in another distant state, or they could have remained deeply embedded within the very community that was actively traumatized by their actions, hiding in plain sight behind a carefully constructed, utterly mundane facade of everyday, boring normalcy. The flawless execution of their terrible crime, aided heavily by the extreme, natural decomposition of the forensic evidence and the isolated, transient nature of the victim's lifestyle, allowed them to completely bypass the heavy scales of justice, leaving behind an agonizing, permanent void where a murder trial and a resulting, severe conviction were desperately needed to definitively restore the moral equilibrium of the island. As this detailed, comprehensive exploration of the Matthew Joel Peak investigation finally reaches its necessary conclusion, it is fundamentally imperative for the public to remember that a cold case file is never truly closed as long as there are dedicated investigators willing to read the documents and a compassionate public willing to listen to the tragic, unresolved details. The renewed, highly coordinated media campaigns launched in 2024 and 2025 by local law enforcement and prominent news outlets represent a vital, ongoing, and stubborn refusal to allow Matthew's memory to be completely swallowed and erased by the relentless, indifferent passage of time. These desperate public appeals rely entirely on the fragile, highly unpredictable nature of human memory, desperately hoping that the sudden broadcast of Matthew's name and the specific geographical details of Waipio Valley, Hilo, and Puna will suddenly and violently dislodge a forgotten, buried fragment of information from the mind of a distant, previously silent witness. Justice for this 22-year-old wanderer no longer hinges on the highly unlikely discovery of a lost fingerprint or a miraculous, sudden technological breakthrough in forensic science, but rather depends entirely on the courage and delayed recollection of an unknown individual who unwittingly holds a tiny, seemingly insignificant piece of a decades-old puzzle. The brutal, undeniable reality of this case is that someone, somewhere in the world, currently possesses the specific, exact knowledge required to finally tear down the impenetrable, heavy wall of silence that has successfully protected a ruthless killer for over a quarter of a century. We must actively continue to share his story, to speak his name aloud, and to critically examine the dark, unresolved corners of our collective history, because actively refusing to forget is the absolute most powerful, enduring weapon we possess against those predators who rely entirely on the silent passage of time to permanently hide their atrocities. Matthew Joel Peak went to the beautiful, isolated edge of the world seeking youthful freedom and boundless adventure, and he was tragically met with a profound darkness that ended his life and permanently shattered the inherent peace of the valley. It remains our collective societal responsibility to ensure that this violent darkness does not get to dictate the final, undisputed word, and that the relentless search for the truth continues, passionately and unapologetically, until the absolute final shadow is completely illuminated. The harsh, absolute physical reality of an unsolved homicide file is a profoundly depressing testament to the limitations of human justice, existing as a stagnant, decaying monument to a violently interrupted life. When an investigation officially transitions from a frantic, active manhunt into the agonizing, bureaucratic purgatory of a cold case, the tangible elements of the victim's tragedy are systematically reduced to a series of heavily categorized cardboard boxes resting silently on the reinforced steel shelves of a police department archive. Inside these boxes lie the incredibly bleak, clinical remnants of Matthew Joel Peak's final days on Earth, encapsulated in fading crime scene photographs that document the disturbed black sand of Waipio Valley. Detailed autopsy reports outlining the horrific biological mechanics of his fatal asphyxiation, and sprawling, disorganized logs of desperately conducted, ultimately fruitless witness interviews. As the relentless decades pass, the actual paper containing these vital, tragic details slowly yellows and becomes brittle, serving as a dark, permanent, and physical metaphor for the degrading nature of human memory and the diminishing probability of ever achieving true legal resolution. This archived, silent file represents a suspended, agonizing state of permanent interruption, a narrative forcibly halted before its necessary, moral conclusion, leaving the dedicated investigators who occasionally review the documents trapped in a cycle of repetitive frustration. They pull the boxes down, meticulously reread the exact same sparse, unyielding facts regarding the transient hitchhiker and the anonymous perpetrator, hoping desperately that a new, modern perspective might suddenly illuminate a previously overlooked, microscopic connection, only to inevitably return the file to the dark shelf without a single new actionable lead. The sheer, heavy physical weight of the case file is negligible compared to the immense psychological burden it places upon the conscience of the law enforcement community today, tomorrow, and forever. This profound, enduring absence of a legal resolution radiates outward from the police archives, deeply infecting the collective psychological landscape of the surrounding Hawaiian community and fundamentally altering the way the local residents interact with the breathtaking, expansive natural environment. When a horrific, intimately violent crime like manual strangulation occurs in a location historically revered for its intense spiritual sanctity and profound natural beauty, the surrounding geography is permanently scarred by an invisible, lingering atmosphere of profound trauma and unresolved paranoia. Waipio Valley, traditionally celebrated as a majestic, isolated sanctuary offering peace and profound connection to the natural world, is forced to simultaneously bear the heavy, dark identity of a successful, unpunished execution site, creating a deeply unsettling cognitive dissonance for anyone who visits the black sand beach. The knowledge that a brutal predator utilized the steep, treacherous cliffs and the heavy, shifting sands as a geographical accomplice to deliberately conceal a human body completely shatters the fundamental illusion of safety that normally accompanies the exploration of paradise. Furthermore, because the perpetrator was never identified, arrested, or publicly exposed, the community is forced to endure a chronic, low-level state of suspicion, recognizing the terrifying, completely plausible reality that the killer could have easily blended back into the transient, off-the-grid subcultures that populate the Hilo and Puna districts. The vibrant, trusting culture of hitchhiking and communal reliance that defined Matthew Joel Peak's daily existence is irrevocably tainted by the grim realization that one of those anonymous passing vehicles contained a monster entirely capable of squeezing the life from a 22-year-old boy simply looking for his next destination. This unresolved tragedy serves as a constant, chilling reminder to the entire island that extreme, calculated human malice is absolutely not confined exclusively to dark, urban alleyways anywhere in this vast world of ours. To critically examine the cold case of Matthew Joel Peak is to inherently confront the deeply terrifying, almost incomprehensible psychological profile of an individual who possesses the chilling capacity to commit an act of ultimate, intimate violence, and subsequently navigate decades of completely normal existence without ever succumbing to the crushing weight of their own overwhelming guilt. The deliberate, highly physical act of asphyxiating a healthy young man requires a profound, terrifying degree of psychological detachment and an absolute, cold-blooded commitment to destroying a human life, an action that completely severs the perpetrator from the fundamental, empathetic boundaries of normal human behavior. Following this brutal execution, the killer demonstrated an astonishing, highly calculated level of self-preservation by engaging in the grueling, physically demanding task of digging a shallow grave in the heavy volcanic sand, attempting to permanently erase the visual evidence of their horrific atrocity. The truly horrifying aspect of this specific narrative is the undisputed, historical fact that this extreme, desperate strategy of concealment was incredibly, flawlessly successful, allowing the killer to simply walk away from the remote valley floor and completely reintegrate into society without facing a single legal repercussion whatsoever. For over a quarter of a century, this anonymous individual has successfully managed to deeply compartmentalize the horrific memory of what they did on the black sand beach, building an intricate, impenetrable psychological fortress to protect their horrific secret from the scrutinizing, judgmental eyes of the surrounding world. They have likely lived a life completely characterized by mundane, everyday routines, perhaps holding down regular employment, maintaining seemingly normal personal relationships, and participating in the standard, everyday activities of their local community, completely masking the dark, rotting core of their true, monstrous nature, hiding effortlessly within plain sight of everyone around them every single passing day and night. As the heavy, unrelenting decades continue to accumulate, the fundamental responsibility for securing justice in profoundly stalled, deeply aged cold cases shifts significantly from the active, localized efforts of law enforcement to the broader, collective memory of the general public, transforming the pursuit of the truth into a vital, deeply necessary societal obligation. The strategic, coordinated media campaigns initiated by the Hawaii Police Department deliberately leverage the vast, interconnected reach of modern communication platforms to aggressively push the tragic narrative of Matthew Joel Peak back into the active, conscious awareness of the entire population. These desperate, vital public appeals are completely rooted in the fundamental psychological understanding that the critical, missing piece of the investigative puzzle is almost certainly locked within the dormant, completely unaccessed memory of an individual who currently has absolutely no conscious realization of their immense, pivotal importance to a decades-old murder inquiry. The authorities are not searching for a miraculous confession, they are desperately hunting for a fragmented, deeply buried recollection of a seemingly minor anomaly involving a strange vehicle parked near the Valley Access Road, or a highly unusual conversation in a Hilo bar during the early summer of 1999. By relentlessly broadcasting the specific, unyielding facts of the asphyxiation and the transient lifestyle of the 22-year-old victim, the media serves as a powerful, necessary catalyst, attempting to violently dislodge these crucial, microscopic details from the heavy fog of the passing years. The true crime audience, the local residents, and the former transient travelers of the Big Island are fundamentally transformed from passive, entertained observers into active, vital participants in the sprawling, unresolved hunt for a ruthless killer, bearing the profound moral responsibility to carefully search their own personal histories for any potential hidden connection completely related to this tragic incident forever and always. Ultimately, beneath the sprawling, complex layers of forensic limitations, the profound geographical challenges of the isolated environment, and the deeply frustrating, agonizing silence of the surrounding legal void, the absolute core of this tragic narrative remains securely anchored to the devastating loss of a single, highly adventurous human life. Matthew Joel Peak was not a statistic. He was not merely a fascinating, complicated puzzle for armchair detectives to intellectually dissect, and he was absolutely not destined to become an anonymous, forgotten casualty buried in the heavy black sands of the majestic Hawaiian coastline. He was a vibrant, deeply trusting 22-year-old boy who possessed a profound, inherent desire to freely explore the sprawling, beautiful extremities of the world, relying heavily on the fundamental kindness of strangers to completely navigate the winding, rural highways of his youthful,
affecté existence.
The absolute cruelty of his brutal, calculated murder lies not just in the terrifying, intimate mechanics of his fatal asphyxiation, but in the catastrophic, permanent theft of his entire unwritten future, the complete, violent erasure of every single subsequent milestone, joy, and experience he was inherently entitled to pursue. The complete absence of a definitive legal resolution, the permanently empty courtroom, and the completely unpunished freedom of his anonymous executioner serve as a constant, deeply painful, and completely open-wound on the collective conscience of society, demanding that we completely refuse to allow his memory to quietly fade into the absolute darkness of historical obscurity. We must deliberately, continuously speak his name, meticulously recount the specific, verified facts of his tragic, unsolved demise, and aggressively challenge the enduring, terrifying silence that currently protects the monster who violently extinguished his life on the edge of the Pacific Ocean, continuing the relentless search until the ultimate, hidden truth is finally revealed to absolutely everyone everywhere. The physical environment of the Hawaiian Islands is characterized by a profound, ancient geological memory that stands in stark, unforgiving contrast to the fleeting, fragile nature of human existence. When we observe the towering, emerald cliffs of Waipio Valley and the relentless, pounding rhythm of the dark Pacific surf, we are bearing witness to a landscape that has endured for countless millennia, completely indifferent to the chaotic, transient dramas of the human beings who temporarily wander across its surface. The heavy, dark volcanic sand that briefly served as a shallow, horrific grave for a violently murdered 22-year-old boy is the product of ancient eruptions and endless coastal erosion. A natural cycle that continues continuously without any regard for the moral atrocities committed within its shadows. This profound environmental indifference creates a deeply haunting backdrop for the unsolved homicide of Matthew Joel Peak, emphasizing the terrifying reality that the natural world will absolutely never reveal the dark, hidden secrets it passively absorbed on that fateful afternoon in 1999. The Earth accepted his severely decomposed body, hid the brutal evidence of his fatal asphyxiation, and would have silently kept the terrifying secret of his murder for all eternity if a random dog had not instinctually dug into the disturbed dunes. The sheer, overwhelming permanence of the valley underscores the heartbreaking brevity of Matthew's stolen life, reminding us that while the majestic Hawaiian landscape will majestically persist for millions of years, a vibrant, optimistic human life can be permanently and violently extinguished in a matter of desperate, agonizing minutes. We are forced to grapple with the terrifying philosophical concept that a landscape so universally celebrated for its spiritual tranquility and breathtaking beauty can simultaneously serve as the perfect, completely silent accomplice to a cold-blooded predator seeking to permanently erase another human being from the face of the planet without leaving a single identifiable trace of their malicious actions whatsoever. The lingering, unresolved shadow of this horrific crime also fundamentally altered the cultural and sociological landscape of the specific, closely knit communities where Matthew spent his final, undocumented days wandering freely. In the late 1990s, the rural, deeply lush districts of Hilo and Puna were heavily characterized by a vibrant, deeply trusting counterculture, a unique social ecosystem where hitchhiking, transient living, and off-the-grid independence were not merely tolerated, but actively embraced as legitimate expressions of personal freedom. Young wanderers from all across the globe flocked to the Big Island specifically to participate in this beautiful, utopian vision of communal trust, relying entirely on the inherent goodness of anonymous strangers to transport them safely along the winding, breathtaking coastal highways. However, the brutal, unpunished asphyxiation of a fellow traveler violently shattered that fragile illusion of universal goodwill, injecting a permanent, heavy dose of paranoia and existential dread into a subculture that completely depended upon blind trust for its very survival. The terrifying realization that a ruthless, calculating murderer was actively hunting within that specific, vulnerable demographic fundamentally changed the psychological calculus of stepping onto the shoulder of a road with an extended thumb. Every passing vehicle transformed from a potential avenue of joyous adventure into a highly unpredictable, potentially lethal threat, completely forcing the local transient community to desperately reevaluate their personal safety in an environment they had previously considered to be a completely safe, spiritual haven. The cold case of Matthew Joel Peak represents the violent, abrupt death of a specific era of innocence on the island, serving as a dark, permanent warning that predators effortlessly infiltrate even the most idyllic, trusting communities, weaponizing the beautiful concept of human kindness to isolate, overpower, and ultimately destroy the most incredibly vulnerable members of our society completely unnoticed. The agonizing, prolonged state of an unsolved homicide completely inflicts a very specific, deeply corrosive psychological trauma upon the collective consciousness of society, a phenomenon that sociologists frequently refer to as an ambiguous loss of the highest order. Because there is absolutely no definitive legal resolution, no identified suspect, and completely zero accountability for the horrific violence committed on the black sand beach, the surrounding community is permanently denied the necessary structural closure that normally allows human beings to properly process and eventually move forward from a traumatic event. This profound lack of answers creates a massive, suffocating vacuum of information that is inevitably filled with endless, terrifying speculation and a chronic, low-level atmosphere of enduring societal anxiety. The deeply disturbing, intimate nature of the specific murder, the undisputed medical fact that the killer had to physically restrict the airway of a healthy 22-year-old man until he completely stopped breathing, heavily amplifies this collective terror, forcing everyone to acknowledge that a monster capable of extreme, sustained violence successfully escaped without facing any consequences. The horrifying reality is that the hands that violently choked the absolute life out of Matthew Joel Peak are the exact same hands that might have subsequently paid for groceries at a local market, gripped the steering wheel of a car driving through Hilo, or casually waved at a passing neighbor in the years following the brutal crime. The murderer successfully executed a flawless, devastating act of violence, leveraging the extreme isolation of Waipio Valley and the rapid, natural decomposition of the victim's body to completely outmaneuver the entire modern criminal justice system. They possess the dark, rotting knowledge of their own supreme guilt, carrying the heavy, terrifying secret of the shallow grave entirely within the silent, impenetrable fortress of their own mind, completely safe from the probing, desperate inquiries of the frustrated detectives who continue to manage the aging, completely stagnant police files year after year without fail. To fully honor the tragic, permanently unresolved legacy of this deeply devastating case, we must make a conscious, unwavering commitment to completely reject the passive, easy comfort of societal amnesia and actively demand that the relentless pursuit of justice continues unconditionally forever. The strategic, massive media campaigns periodically launched by the frustrated law enforcement agencies are not merely routine administrative procedures. They are absolutely desperate, vital lifelines cast out into the vast, unpredictable ocean of public memory. The authorities inherently understand that they are fighting a constantly losing battle against the relentless, corrosive passage of time, which naturally fades human recollection, degrades potential physical evidence, and slowly buries the acute emotional urgency of the 1999 tragedy under decades of subsequent island history. Yet, they continue to passionately broadcast Matthew's name and the specific, chilling details of his fatal asphyxiation because they firmly believe in the incredible, unpredictable power of a single, sudden human realization. They are desperately banking on the mathematical probability that someone, somewhere, is quietly holding a completely overlooked, seemingly insignificant fragment of truth that could instantly shatter the killer's perfectly constructed, decades-old alibi. It might be a deeply repressed memory of a strange, highly erratic interaction with a transient individual in the Puna district, a sudden, terrifying realization about an old acquaintance who abruptly fled the Hawaiian Islands immediately after the 1st of June, or a haunting, lingering visual recollection of a deeply suspicious vehicle parked recklessly near the treacherous, plunging cliffs of the Valley Road. The absolute burden of solving this horrific crime has completely shifted from the quiet, sterile archives of the local police department directly onto the collective shoulders of the general public, demanding that every single person actively search their own historical memories for any hidden clues. The ultimate, overarching tragedy of the Matthew Joel Peak investigation is that a vibrant, incredibly adventurous 22-year-old boy was permanently reduced to a tragic, cautionary tale about the inherent, hidden dangers of seeking absolute freedom on the rugged edges of the world. He traveled to the breathtaking, isolated expanses of the Big Island with a youthful, optimistic heart, looking to deeply connect with the natural beauty and the communal spirit of the local transient culture, only to cross paths with an anonymous, ruthless predator who completely destroyed his entire universe in a matter of violent, terrifying minutes. The permanently empty courtroom, the completely blank suspect board, and the heavy, dusty boxes of unresolved police files all serve as a monumentally depressing testament to a justice system that was utterly defeated by a combination of geographic isolation and catastrophic evidentiary loss. However, completely abandoning the search for his killer would be the ultimate, unforgivable betrayal of his memory, a silent, cowardly acceptance that some acts of extreme violence are simply allowed to remain permanently unpunished. We must continue to fiercely advocate for the truth, to consistently speak his name into the endless void, and to absolutely refuse to allow the majestic, deeply sacred sands of Waipio Valley to hold onto this terrible, rotting secret forever. The young hitchhiker whose life was violently stolen on that remote, beautiful coastline completely deserves the total, unyielding dedication of a society that refuses to forget, ensuring that the anonymous monster who committed this atrocity is eventually brought into the light of final justice. No matter what silent decades must pass before the truth is revealed. The final contemplation of this profound tragedy forces us to confront the absolute limits of human understanding and the terrifying vastness of unsolved crimes that quietly permeate our modern civilization. When a life as vibrant and deeply adventurous as that of Matthew Joel Peak is violently extinguished in the remote shadows of Waipio Valley, the resulting silence echoes eternally through the dense tropical canopy and across the unforgiving expanse of the Pacific Ocean. We are left completely stranded in a maddening state of permanent ambiguity, searching desperately for a logical conclusion that simply does not exist within the available evidence. This total absence of structural justice fundamentally destabilizes our inherent, psychological need for moral equilibrium, replacing the comforting certainty of a solved case with an enduring, suffocating atmosphere of communal dread. The realization that the perpetrator navigated the severe logistical challenges of committing a physically demanding asphyxiation and subsequently burying a heavy body in the dark volcanic sand without leaving a single identifiable trace is utterly paralyzing. It implies a level of calculated malice and cold-blooded efficiency that completely defies our standard understanding of spontaneous violence, suggesting a predator completely devoid of basic human empathy and entirely focused on survival. As the unrelenting decades silently accumulate, the physical and administrative remnants of the investigation continue to degrade inside the heavily secured archives of the Hawaii Police Department, transforming from urgent, active inquiries into fading historical artifacts. The brittle, yellowing pages of the autopsy report and the dark, terrifying crime scene photographs gradually lose their immediate, visceral impact, becoming abstract representations of a violence that occurred in a world that fundamentally no longer exists. The technological advancements, the widespread implementation of digital surveillance, and the complete sociological transformation of the Big Island have overwritten the specific cultural landscape of 1999. Yet despite these massive societal shifts, the absolute truth regarding what happened on that pristine black sand beach remains permanently locked in the past, completely immune to the relentless march of modern progress. The killer exists in a terrifying state of historical suspension, an anonymous, faceless entity who successfully committed the ultimate crime and effortlessly dissolved back into the mundane fabric of everyday society. They were never forced to face the searing, public scrutiny of a highly publicized murder trial, nor were they subjected to the severe, highly restrictive punishments legally mandated for such an incredibly brutal and calculated atrocity. They have been granted the unearned, absolute privilege of experiencing the natural progression of human life, feeling the warmth of the tropical sun, forming complex emotional relationships, and moving freely across the globe, all while secretly carrying the immense, crushing weight of their own supreme guilt. The psychological fortitude required to successfully mask such a horrific history from colleagues, friends, and potentially even family members is profoundly disturbing, indicating a highly compartmentalized mind capable of separating extreme, intimate violence from the standard, mundane interactions that comprise a completely normal, unremarkable daily existence in any community, anywhere in the world. This chilling reality heavily underscores the absolute necessity of maintaining a relentless, unyielding public focus on the unresolved narrative of Matthew Joel Peak, completely refusing to allow his tragic demise to quietly fade into the comfortable obscurity of forgotten island lore. The passionate, highly coordinated media appeals consistently generated by frustrated law enforcement agencies are entirely designed to violently disrupt the quiet, comfortable existence of the perpetrator, desperately attempting to generate a massive wave of public pressure that might eventually force a fatal mistake. The authorities fundamentally recognize that the conventional, forensic avenues of investigation have been completely and utterly exhausted. Therefore, the entire burden of securing long-delayed justice now rests completely upon the fragile, unpredictable mechanism of human memory and the distant hope that an unknown witness might suddenly realize the profound significance of a completely forgotten detail. The specific target of these massive public awareness campaigns is not necessarily the killer themselves, but rather the peripheral individuals who might have unwittingly observed a crucial, completely unexplainable anomaly during the late spring of 1999. It could be a sudden, violent change in a local resident's behavior, an unexplained, hasty departure from the Hilo or Puna districts, or strange vehicles. Every single passing year heavily intensifies the desperate, agonizing urgency of this sprawling public hunt, because the inevitable, biological realities of human aging mean that the remaining pool of potential witnesses is constantly and tragically shrinking. If the individual possessing the missing, critical fragment of this complex puzzle passes away before realizing the immense value of their hidden knowledge, the absolute final opportunity to successfully identify the murderer will be permanently lost to the unforgiving void of time. This terrifying biological deadline adds a heavy, desperate atmosphere to every single podcast broadcast, every local news segment, and every police press release. We must actively embrace the heavy, collective responsibility of serving as the permanent, unyielding voice for a vibrant young man whose own voice was permanently silenced by a monster operating under the dark, majestic cliffs of Waipio Valley. Matthew was a deeply trusting, wildly adventurous soul who traveled to the breathtaking edges of the Hawaiian archipelago seeking absolute personal freedom and a profound connection to the natural world, only to tragically encounter the absolute darkest, most predatory elements of human nature. The profound cruelty of his sudden, violent death completely shatters the idealized, romanticized vision of the transient lifestyle. It serves as a stark, permanent reminder that extreme vulnerability can easily be weaponized by those who completely operate outside the fundamental boundaries of basic human morality, transforming a peaceful, spiritual sanctuary into a deeply terrifying, entirely unmonitored hunting ground. The complete failure of the surrounding criminal justice system to immediately identify, apprehend, and severely punish the anonymous individual responsible for this horrific act of lethal asphyxiation leaves a gaping, bleeding wound on the historical conscience of the Big Island. We cannot look away from this enduring tragedy because passive acceptance of an unsolved murder fundamentally degrades our societal integrity. By continuously demanding answers and keeping the specific, highly disturbing details of the Waipio Valley murder actively circulating within the collective public consciousness, we are actively participating in a massive, ongoing act of profound moral resistance against the silence. We are sending a clear, completely undeniable message to the invisible perpetrator that their flawless execution of a terrible crime has not been completely forgotten, and that the surrounding community absolutely refuses to surrender the pursuit of the ultimate truth regardless of how many agonizing decades unfortunately pass. The heavy, dark volcanic sand of that incredibly remote, beautiful beach holds secrets. It may have temporarily concealed the severely decomposed physical evidence of the brutal crime, but it can never successfully bury the enduring, passionate demand for absolute accountability that continues to passionately radiate from the frustrated investigators and the deeply empathetic public. The memory of Matthew Joel Peak fundamentally demands this sustained, unyielding level of fierce dedication, because walking away from the completely stalled investigation would be equivalent to granting the unknown killer a final, completely undisputed victory over the immense value of human life. We must stand in the uncomfortable, terrifying void left behind by the absolute lack of justice. We must use our collective, amplified voices to constantly illuminate the dark, unexplored corners of this baffling mystery, desperately searching the fading, fragile memories of anyone who might have traveled through the lush, rural districts of Hilo and Puna during that fateful period. The absolute truth regarding exactly what happened in the days leading up to the tragic discovery of the shallow grave on the afternoon of June 1st is still out there, completely hidden within the mind of someone who currently walks freely among us. The relentless, passionate pursuit of that hidden truth is not merely journalistic exercise. It is a profound, deeply necessary act of honoring a young life that was violently stolen, ensuring that the terrible, intimate brutality of manual strangulation does not completely define the absolute final chapter of his incredibly short, adventurous existence on Earth. We must aggressively challenge the deeply unsettling, pervasive silence that currently surrounds the cold case files, heavily pushing back against the apathetic, corrosive forces of time that constantly threaten to completely erase the memory of a vibrant, deeply trusting wanderer. The breathtaking, majestic expanse of Waipio Valley will forever remain fundamentally altered by the horrific, unsolved violence that occurred. It will permanently stand as a massive, silent monument to a devastating tragedy, serving as a constant, heavy reminder of the profound fragility of human life and the terrifying, completely unpredictable nature of the hidden predators who occasionally walk among us. Until the day finally arrives when the absolute truth is completely uncovered and the anonymous monster is finally forced to face the severe, uncompromising consequences of their horrific actions, we will continue to tell the deeply heartbreaking story of Matthew Joel Peak, forever holding onto the desperate, unyielding hope that justice will ultimately prevail against the absolute darkest shadows.